The Pokémon world carries secrets within its quietest corners, mysteries that drift like fog through ancient forests and settle softly over forgotten ruins. Some puzzles appear in old texts written by researchers who questioned what they witnessed, while others emerge from shadows cast by creatures no one fully understands. Before we drift off, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload, and let me know where you're watching from. And the best place to start is with civilizations that vanished centuries ago, leaving behind only fractured stones and questions no one can answer. Ruins scattered across multiple regions hint at cultures far older than recorded history. The stones sit weathered and silent, carved with symbols that resist translation. Researchers who study these sites find patterns suggesting advanced understanding of Pokémon behavior, yet the builders left no written records explaining their methods or beliefs. Some structures appear designed for human habitation, while others feature doorways and chambers scaled for creatures much larger than any species alive today. This discrepancy raises questions about whether ancient peoples lived alongside Pokémon of extraordinary size, or whether these spaces served ceremonial purposes connecting humans to forces they considered divine. The tablets found near these ruins display imagery that blurs the line between documentation and mythology. Figures resembling modern Pokémon appear alongside beings that match no known species, suggesting either artistic interpretation or the existence of creatures that have since disappeared. Some carvings show humans and Pokémon working together in ways that feel more intimate than contemporary partnerships, hinting at bonds that went deeper than training or companionship. Others depict gatherings around massive stones that glow with energy, events that might have been religious ceremonies or scientific experiments lost to time. Certain ruins contain chambers that amplify sound in unusual ways, creating echoes that last far longer than physics should allow. Researchers standing in these spaces report hearing faint tones that seem to come from nowhere, harmonies that fade slowly into silence. Pokémon brought into these chambers often react with recognition, tilting their heads or humming softly as though responding to something humans cannot perceive. These acoustic properties suggest the chambers were designed with intention, perhaps to communicate with Pokémon using frequencies outside human hearing range, or to conduct rituals that required specific sound patterns. The sudden disappearance of these civilizations remains unexplained. There are no signs of war, no evidence of plague or famine that would account for entire populations vanishing within short periods. The ruins simply end, structures left half-finished, tools abandoned in place, as though the inhabitants departed in haste or were removed by forces beyond their control. Some theories propose natural disasters that struck without warning, while others speculate about dimensional rifts or migrations to regions yet undiscovered. The lack of closure makes these ruins feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of unanswered questions. Fossil Pokémon introduce their own quiet mysteries, creatures revived from ancient stone through processes that remain partially understood. The revival technology reconstructs genetic material from fragments, filling gaps with educated guesses based on related species. This method creates living Pokémon, but researchers admit uncertainty about how closely these revivals match their original forms. Subtle differences in coloration, size, or behavior might distinguish modern fossils from their prehistoric counterparts, raising the possibility that trainers encounter approximations rather than perfect recreations. The incompleteness of the fossil record compounds this uncertainty. For every species successfully revived, countless others left no remains, their existences erased by time and geological processes. Entire ecosystems might have thrived and disappeared without leaving evidence, populated by creatures that modern science will never encounter. The fossils that do survive represent random snapshots of ancient eras, moments preserved by chance rather than intention. This fragmented view makes it impossible to know how many species have been lost or how dramatically ancient environments differed from contemporary ones. Some revived Pokémon display behaviors that seem out of place in modern contexts, suggesting instincts shaped by vanished ecosystems. Certain species react to stimuli that no longer exist, searching for food sources that went extinct millennia ago, or exhibiting mating rituals designed for environments fundamentally different from present habitats. These behavioral quirks provide glimpses into worlds that existed long before human history began, worlds where different rules governed survival and interaction. They also raise ethical questions about reviving creatures into eras they were never meant to inhabit. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos and let me know where you're listening from tonight. The variation between fossil specimens from different regions adds another layer of complexity. Pokémon of the same species revived in separate locations sometimes show unexpected differences, as though regional conditions during their original era shaped distinct populations. These variations suggest that ancient species were more diverse than modern assumptions account for, with local adaptations that disappeared as environments changed. It also implies that current revival methods might produce results specific to the fossil's origin point rather than universal representations of the species. The oceans hold mysteries deeper than any exploration has reached, vast stretches of water where light never penetrates and pressure makes direct observation impossible. Sailors and fishermen report sightings of massive shapes moving beneath their vessels, forms too large to match any documented species. These encounters occur in deep waters far from shore, where the ocean floor drops away into trenches that could conceal entire ecosystems. The witnesses describe movements that feel deliberate rather than random, as though something enormous navigates through darkness with purpose and awareness. Glowing patterns appear in certain deep waters during specific lunar phases, arrays of bioluminescent marks that pulse in synchronized rhythms. These lights form geometric shapes that repeat across vast distances, suggesting communication or coordination between creatures spread throughout the depths. Pokémon with advanced sensory abilities sometimes react to these displays even when aboard ships, becoming agitated or entranced, depending on the pattern. Scientists who study these phenomena lack the equipment to observe them directly, relying instead on sonar readings and surface observations that capture only fragments of what occurs below. Underwater caves discovered along continental shelves reveal entrances to networks that extend far deeper than mapping technology can follow. Some passages slope downward at angles that suggest they connect to geothermal vents or subterranean water systems, while others branch in ways that feel deliberately constructed rather than naturally formed. Pokémon sometimes emerge from these caves, carrying objects or displaying behaviors that imply they've traveled through extensive underground systems, raising questions about what lies at the end of these hidden routes and whether they connect distant regions through pathways unknown to surface dwellers. Temperature anomalies in certain ocean zones create pockets where water remains warm, despite surrounding cold currents, or cold despite nearby thermal activity. These zones attract specific Pokémon species that gather in concentrations found nowhere else, forming to temporary communities that dissolve as the temperature pockets shift. The mechanisms creating these anomalies remain unclear, with theories ranging from underwater volcanic activity to energy emissions from sources yet undiscovered. Pokémon seem to predict these zones before instruments detect them, arriving days ahead of measurable changes, as though sensing something beyond temperature itself. Sudden population shifts see Pokémon appearing in regions far outside their documented ranges. Species that should be confined to specific habitats showing up in areas separated by vast distances. These occurrences happen without warning and without clear migration patterns, as though the Pokémon traveled through routes that bypass normal geography. Some theories propose hidden pathways through cave systems or underwater channels that surface maps have missed, while others suggest dimensional distortions that allow brief transit between distant locations. The Pokémon themselves offer no explanation, settling into their new environments as though the displacement were entirely natural. Seasonal migrations follow routes that sometimes deviate from established patterns, with entire flocks or schools altering their paths for reasons that elude observation. These changes occur uniformly across populations, suggesting some form of collective decision-making or response to environmental cues too subtle for human detection. Pokémon that normally migrate along coastlines might suddenly choose inland routes, while species that favor mountain passes abruptly shift to valleys. The deviations last for single seasons before populations return to traditional paths, leaving researchers to wonder what prompted the temporary change and whether similar shifts occurred in previous eras. Certain locations serve as gathering points for diverse species that normally avoid each other. Clearings or beaches where natural competitors arrive simultaneously and maintain peaceful coexistence for brief periods. These gatherings follow no predictable schedule, occurring randomly throughout the year without correlation to weather patterns or celestial events. Pokémon participating in these assemblies engage in no apparent activity, simply remaining in proximity until some unseen signal prompts simultaneous departure. The purpose of these gatherings remains unknown, though observers note that participating Pokémon often display increased vitality in subsequent weeks. Time manifests strangely in specific regions, locations where clocks run slower or faster than surrounding areas without mechanical explanation. Trainers entering these zones report that hours pass differently inside than outside, with journeys that feel brief, consuming entire days, or lengthy explorations concluding in mere minutes. Pokémon native to these areas seem unaffected, their biological rhythms remaining stable while external timepieces falter. The boundaries of these temporal anomalies remain consistent, creating invisible borders where time shifts abruptly between normal flow and altered states. Wild Pokémon in certain forests appear at the same locations at precisely the same moments each year, as though following schedules written into their biology. These appearances occur regardless of weather conditions or environmental changes, with the Pokémon arriving within seconds of predetermined times and remaining for exact durations before departing. The precision suggests awareness that transcends instinct, implying either inherited memories that span generations or sensitivity to cosmic patterns invisible to human observation. Some researchers believe these timed appearances mark anniversaries of significant events from ancient eras, while others propose they represent biological responses to subtle gravitational shifts. Eclipse events trigger unusual behaviors across multiple species simultaneously, with Pokémon gathering in open areas and adopting formations that mirror celestial alignments. During solar eclipses, some species form circles around elevated points, facing outward in patterns that suggest defensive or ceremonial arrangements. Lunar eclipses prompt different responses, with nocturnal Pokémon emerging in daylight and diurnal species remaining active through darkness. These behaviors cease precisely when eclipses end, with participating Pokémon dispersing as though released from invisible constraints. The consistency of these responses across unrelated species implies shared awareness of astronomical events beyond simple light sensitivity. Meteor showers inspire mass migrations to specific hilltops and clearings, with Pokémon from diverse habitats converging on these sites hours before meteors become visible. The gatherings include species that rarely venture from their home territories, suggesting that whatever draws them outweighs territorial instincts. During the showers, assembled Pokémon remain motionless, watching the sky with focused attention that feels more ritualistic than instinctive. Some witnesses report hearing harmonized vocalizations during peak meteor activity, choruses that rise and fall with the frequency of visible meteors. Old buildings in modern cities sometimes feature architectural elements that predate surrounding structures, walls constructed with techniques forgotten by contemporary builders, or stones that bear no relation to local geology. These anachronistic elements suggest either preservation of ancient construction or transplantation of materials from distant sites. Some buildings contain sealed chambers discovered only during renovations, spaces filled with artifacts that resist dating, or tools designed for purposes no one recognizes. The presence of these hidden rooms implies that certain structures served multiple functions throughout their existence, with original purposes concealed beneath later additions. Stone carvings on certain buildings depict Pokémon species that match no documented forms, creatures that combine features from multiple known species, or display characteristics unique to the carvings themselves. Art historians debate whether these represent artistic interpretations, extinct species, or regional variants that disappeared before formal documentation began. The carvings often appear in locations that suggest significance, positioned above doorways or within courtyards where they would be seen regularly by inhabitants. Their preservation, despite centuries of weathering, implies intentional maintenance or materials naturally resistant to decay. Underground passages connect buildings in ways that official maps don't acknowledge, tunnels that allow movement between structures without surface travel. Some passages clearly served practical purposes, providing routes for trade or defense during historical conflicts. Others follow no logical pattern, connecting buildings with no obvious relationship and terminating at walls or chambers that appear deliberately sealed. Pokémon occasionally emerge from these passages, particularly during storms or unusual weather, suggesting that they use the tunnels as shelter or transit routes independent of human awareness. Foundations of demolished buildings sometimes reveal older structures beneath them, layers of construction indicating that modern cities rest atop multiple previous settlements. These buried structures show architectural styles that differ dramatically from surface buildings, suggesting cultural shifts or population replacements that history books don't record. Objects found in these lower layers include tools, pottery, and decorative items that imply sophisticated societies existed long before official timelines begin. The discovery of these sites forces re-evaluation of settlement patterns and raises questions about how many earlier civilizations have been paved over and forgotten. Legends passed through oral traditions in remote villages tell stories that predate written records, narratives describing events that supposedly occurred thousands of years before contemporary history begins. Many legends reference partnerships between humans and Pokémon that sound impossibly deep, describing communication without words and cooperation that transcended species boundaries. While some dismiss these stories as mythology, certain details prove surprisingly accurate when compared against archaeological findings, suggesting that legends preserve kernels of historical truth wrapped in narrative embellishment. Stories about disappeared cities appear in legends from multiple unconnected regions, all describing advanced settlements that vanished overnight without trace. The descriptions share common elements: cities built with white stone that glowed faintly at night, inhabitants who lived for centuries, and sudden departures that left no explanation. Some legends claim these cities still exist in hidden locations, protected by barriers that keep them separate from the contemporary world. Others suggest they exist in different dimensions, visible only during specific conditions or to individuals possessing particular sensitivities. Legendary Pokémon feature prominently in traditional stories, often portrayed as mediators between human civilization and natural forces. These narratives describe legendary Pokémon teaching humans essential skills, arbitrating disputes between communities, or intervening during disasters to restore balance. The stories present these beings not as distant gods, but as active participants in daily life, creatures that walked among people and shaped cultures through direct interaction. The transition from these active roles to the hidden existences legendary Pokémon maintain in modern times remains unexplained, as though something changed that made close contact between humans and these powerful beings impossible or undesirable. Prophecies preserved in village records describe future events with unsettling specificity, predictions that supposedly originated from Pokémon capable of perceiving time non-linearly. Some prophecies reference technological developments that didn't exist when the predictions were recorded, while others describe environmental changes that only recently began manifesting. The accuracy of certain prophecies lends credibility to others that haven't yet come to pass, creating uncertainty about whether these predictions represent genuine foresight or fortunate coincidence. Villages that maintain these records treat them with reverence, consulting the texts during important decisions despite modern skepticism about prophetic abilities. Energy readings in specific locations spike without explanation, surges that don't correspond to electrical systems or natural phenomena. These spikes occur at regular intervals, following patterns that suggest intention rather than random fluctuation. Pokémon sensitive to energy fields react to these spikes before instruments detect them, becoming agitated or excited depending on the spike's characteristics. Some locations experience multiple types of energy surges, each producing different effects on nearby Pokémon and electronics. The source of these emanations remains undiscovered despite extensive investigation. Electromagnetic anomalies create zones where compasses spin uselessly and electronic devices malfunction, areas where normal magnetic fields twist into configurations that shouldn't naturally occur. These zones remain stable over years, suggesting permanent alterations to local magnetic properties rather than temporary disturbances. Pokémon with magnetic abilities gravitate toward these zones, spending extended periods within the boundaries before departing abruptly. Scientists studying these areas report that the anomalies don't radiate from central points, but seem distributed evenly throughout the affected space, as though the entire zone shares a single, altered magnetic state. Gravity variations create spots where objects fall slightly slower or faster than surrounding areas, differences measurable with precise instruments, but imperceptible to casual observation. These variations remain consistent regardless of time or weather, indicating permanent alterations to local gravitational fields. Pokémon that fly or levitate show preference for areas with reduced gravity. Using them as resting spots or maintaining altitude requires less energy. The variations cluster in patterns that suggest they're related to underground formations or deep geological structures, though attempts to map correlations between surface anomalies and subsurface features have produced ambiguous results. Dimensional researchers studying reality's structure have identified thin spots where barriers between dimensions grow permeable, locations where brief glimpses into parallel spaces become possible. These thin spots appear randomly and unpredictably, lasting from seconds to minutes before stability returns. Pokémon sometimes pause at these spots as though sensing the thinness, and a few species appear to pass through deliberately, vanishing from sight before reappearing in different locations. The existence of these spots suggests that dimension boundaries are more fluid than previously believed, with natural weak points allowing limited interaction between separate realities. Weather patterns in certain valleys defy meteorological models, creating microclimates that shouldn't exist given their geographical contexts. These valleys might experience permanent fog while surrounding areas remain clear, or maintain warm temperatures despite elevation and latitude indicating otherwise. The mechanisms sustaining these unusual conditions resist explanation, with measurements showing that energy enters these systems from sources that instruments cannot identify. Pokémon populations in these valleys often display characteristics unique to the microclimate, suggesting that sustained exposure to unusual conditions produces evolutionary adaptations over generations. Fog in specific locations manifests with regularity that transcends normal weather patterns, arriving at the same time to daily regardless of temperature or humidity. This fog often carries unusual properties, muffling sound more effectively than normal fog or creating visual distortions that make distance judgment difficult. Pokémon move through this fog with confidence, navigating without hesitation while humans struggle with disorientation. Some researchers propose that the fog contains particles or emanations that Pokémon perceive but humans cannot, giving the creatures navigational advantages in conditions that should impair all vision equally. Rain falls upward in rare locations, droplets rising from the ground toward clouds rather than descending. This inverted precipitation occurs in small areas, localized to specific clearings or sections of fields. The phenomenon lasts for brief periods before normalcy returns, with no apparent trigger or pattern to predict when inversions will occur. Pokémon often play in these inverted rains, leaping and spinning through rising droplets with obvious enjoyment. Scientists attempting to study the effect have found that instruments detect normal gravity during inversions, suggesting that whatever force causes the effect operates on molecular rather than gravitational levels. Snow appears in warm seasons at specific sites, falling briefly before melting instantly upon contact with ground that should be too warm for snow formation. These snow events occur without corresponding temperature drops, with surrounding air remaining comfortably warm even as flakes descend. The snow itself feels abnormally cold, far below temperatures typical of natural snow, and creates patterns on the ground before vanishing that some observers interpret as deliberate shapes. Pokémon native to cold environments sometimes travel great distances to visit these sites during warm season snow events, suggesting they serve purposes beyond simple weather anomalies. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Thunderstorms develop without preceding cloud formation in certain mountainous regions, lightning appearing from clear skies, followed by thunder that echoes unusually long through valleys. These instantaneous storms discharge the energy that exceeds normal lightning intensity, sometimes leaving scorch marks in geometric patterns rather than random branching. Pokémon with electric typing gather at these sites before storms manifest, as though they can sense building charges long before visible signs appear. The storms conclude as abruptly as they begin, clearing skies instantaneously and leaving no moisture despite intense electrical activity. Silence. Zones exist where sound stops propagating beyond invisible boundaries, creating pockets where noise from outside becomes inaudible, despite nothing physical blocking transmission. These zones maintain consistent boundaries that can be precisely mapped, though their sizes fluctuate without pattern. Pokémon entering silence zones often become contemplative, moving slowly and appearing to focus inward rather than on their surroundings. Some trainers report that spending time in these zones produces unexpected emotional clarity or helps resolve internal conflicts, though no measurable mechanism explains these psychological effects. Sound amplifications occur in natural amphitheaters where whispers carry for miles, locations where acoustic properties create transmission effects that shouldn't naturally occur. These sites often become gathering places for Pokémon that rely on vocalizations, with species using the amplification to communicate across distances that would normally require much louder calls. The amplification operates selectively, enhancing certain frequencies while suppressing others, suggesting that whatever creates the effect responds to specific sound properties rather than amplifying all noise equally. Echoes in specific caves return altered versions of original sounds, changing pitch or rhythm in ways that feel intentional rather than random. Some echoes seem to respond to meaning rather than mere sound, returning thoughtful-sounding variations when questions are spoken and energetic responses to celebratory sounds. Pokémon vocalizing in these caves appear to engage in conversations with their echoes, pausing as though listening before responding with different calls. Attempts to record and analyze these interactions reveal that echo variations don't follow acoustic principles that govern normal reverberation, suggesting influence beyond simple sound wave reflection. Stone structures in remote locations emit tones without visible cause, sustained notes that continue indefinitely at constant pitch and volume. These humming stones often sit alone in clearings or along ridgelines, showing no signs of the mechanisms that might produce sound. The tones change occasionally, shifting to different frequencies that create different emotional responses in listeners. Pokémon sometimes sleep against these stones, apparently finding the vibrations soothing, while others avoid them entirely, as though the sounds cause discomfort. Geologists examining the stones find nothing unusual about their composition, yet the humming continues regardless of weather or contact. Ancient temples contain chambers designed to isolate visitors in absolute darkness and perfect silence, spaces where sensory deprivation reaches levels impossible to achieve in natural environments. Trainers who enter these chambers report experiences ranging from meditative calm to disturbing visions, with reactions varying based on individual psychology. Pokémon refuse to enter these chambers, becoming agitated when encouraged to do so, suggesting they perceive something about the spaces that humans miss. The temple's builders left no explanation for these chambers' purposes, though their careful construction indicates they served important functions within whatever practices the temples housed. Meditation spots marked by worn stones or cleared earth appear throughout wilderness areas, locations where prolonged sitting has compressed soil into perfectly level circles. These spots face specific directions with consistency that suggests astronomical alignment or attention to magnetic orientation. Pokémon sometimes join meditating humans at these locations, settling nearby and adopting calm postures. Visitors report that meditation at these traditional spots feels more effective than elsewhere, producing mental states that approach transcendence or providing insights that persist after sessions end. Crystal formations in certain caves emit Faint light without any identifiable energy source, glows that remain constant regardless of external conditions. The light never brightens or dims, maintaining steady luminescence that allows navigation through otherwise pitch-black passages. These crystals feel room temperature despite their glow, showing none of the heat that typically accompanies light emission. Pokémon sometimes carry small crystals from these formations, placing them in nests or dens where the light provides constant illumination. The crystals retain their glow even when separated from the caves, continuing to shine indefinitely without maintenance. Bioluminescent plants grow in underground gardens where no sunlight reaches, ecosystems that thrive in complete darkness through processes that defy botanical principles. These gardens contain diverse species, each producing different colored light that combines into soft, multicolor illumination. The plants photosynthesize using their own light, creating self-sustaining energy cycles that violate thermodynamic expectations. Pokémon native to these gardens show adaptations to the constant low-light environment, possessing enhanced night vision or bioluminescence that complements the plant's glow. Glowing water flows through certain springs, liquid that shimmers with internal light unrelated to mineral content or reflection. This water remains safe to drink, with Pokémon regularly visiting these springs and showing improved vitality afterward. Analysis reveals no unusual chemical composition, yet the glow persists in contained samples indefinitely. Some springs' glow intensifies during specific moon phases, brightening noticeably during full moons and dimming during new moons, despite being underground or otherwise shielded from lunar light. Mushrooms in specific forests pulse with rhythmic light, entire colonies flashing in synchronized patterns that suggest communication or coordination. The pulsing follows mathematical patterns, sequences that repeat with precision, indicating either biological clocks of remarkable accuracy or responses to stimuli that observations haven't identified. Pokémon that consume these mushrooms show no ill effects, though they sometimes display temporary bioluminescence that matches the mushroom's original colors. The colonies can span acres, creating nighttime light shows visible from aerial perspectives. Fireflies in enchanted groves perform aerial dances that create three-dimensional images, formations that depict recognizable shapes floating above the forest floor. These displays change nightly, with different images appearing in sequence as though telling stories or conveying messages. Pokémon gather to watch these displays, remaining remarkably still throughout the performances. Researchers observing the fireflies find no evidence of coordinating mechanisms, yet thousands of individuals maintain perfect timing to create coherent images that last for hours. Mist in specific valleys glows various colors depending on time and season, transformations that create ethereal landscapes where visibility remains good despite dense fog. The mist doesn't obscure vision as normal fog does, instead seeming to enhance perception while adding colored tints to surroundings. Pokémon moving through this mist leave temporary trails that fade slowly, their paths remaining visible for minutes after they pass. Some trainers report that breathing the mist produces mild euphoria and heightened sensory awareness that persists briefly after leaving the valleys. Aurora phenomena occur at low latitudes where they shouldn't naturally appear, light displays that manifest without corresponding solar activity or magnetic disturbances. These irregular auroras form patterns that differ from natural aurora borealis, creating geometric shapes rather than flowing curtains. Pokémon sensitive to magnetic fields react strongly to these displays, sometimes becoming temporarily disoriented or displaying unusual behaviors. The auroras appear without warning and disappear just as suddenly, leaving no measurable trace of the energies that created them. Shadows in certain locations move independently of their sources, sometimes shifting positions when the objects casting them remain motionless. These independent shadows maintain rough correspondence with their sources, but display subtle variations that suggest separate existence. Pokémon occasionally interact with these shadows as though they were solid entities, batting at them or jumping over them in ways that wouldn't occur with normal shadows. The phenomenon occurs only in specific lighting conditions, requiring particular angles of illumination that happen rarely. Mirrors in abandoned buildings sometimes show reflections that don't match current reality, displaying rooms as they appeared in previous eras, or showing figures that aren't present. These anachronistic reflections remain stable, persisting even when observers move or lighting changes. Pokémon avoid looking into these mirrors, turning away or showing signs of distress when positioned where reflections would be visible. The mirrors themselves show no unusual properties when examined, appearing as ordinary glass despite their impossible reflections. Pools of completely still water refuse all attempts at disturbance, remaining mirror smooth even when objects are thrown into them or hands thrust beneath the surface. The water feels normal to touch, flowing around fingers as liquid should, yet returns instantly to perfect stillness once contact ends. These pools reflect with unusual clarity, showing details that observers swear weren't visible in the actual scene. Pokémon drink from these pools without causing ripples, the water somehow transferring into their mouths, while the pool surface remains undisturbed. Ice formations in volcanic areas create impossible juxtapositions, frozen structures that persist despite surrounding heat. The ice never melts, maintaining its form even when ambient temperatures far exceed freezing point. Analysis shows the ice possesses normal chemical composition, containing nothing that would explain its heat resistance. Some formations appear deliberately shaped, resembling sculptures rather than natural ice, though no tool marks or other evidence of carving exists on the surfaces. Heat sources exist without visible fuel, spots where air shimmers with warmth, despite nothing burning or generating thermal energy. These heat zones maintain constant temperatures, never increasing or decreasing regardless of external conditions. Pokémon from cold climates gather at these spots during harsh weather, using them as warming stations that require no maintenance. The heat extends only to specific boundaries, creating sharp transitions where warm air meets normal temperatures without gradual dissipation. Flowers bloom in impossible seasons, species that should only flower during specific months appearing in full bloom during completely wrong times of year. These out-of-season blooms maintain normal biology otherwise, attracting appropriate pollinators and producing viable seeds. Pokémon that rely on seasonal flowers for food sources adapt to these anomalies, checking traditionally early blooming plants during late seasons and vice versa. The cause of mistimed flowering remains undetermined, with affected plants showing no genetic abnormalities or unusual hormone levels. Trees in certain groves display age characteristics that don't match their size, massive specimens with trunk circumferences indicating centuries of growth, but possessing wood grain patterns suggesting much younger trees. Core samples reveal impossible density variations, with some growth rings compressed to fractions of normal width, while others show expansion beyond typical parameters. These trees appear perfectly healthy, showing no signs of disease or environmental stress that might explain their anomalous growth patterns. Fruit from specific orchards possesses properties that defy agricultural science, remaining fresh indefinitely without refrigeration or preservation. The fruit never rots, never loses moisture, never attracts insects despite maintaining normal ripeness indicators. Pokémon eating this fruit show enhanced vitality and sometimes temporary ability boosts, effects that last hours or days depending on quantity consumed. Attempts to cultivate these fruit trees elsewhere consistently fail, suggesting that whatever grants the fruit its properties stems from the orchard locations rather than the trees themselves. Grain fields produce yields that exceed what their soil quality should support, harvests that multiply expected output without corresponding increases in plant health or density. The grain itself contains unusual nutritional profiles, possessing higher concentrations of proteins and minerals than same varieties grown in optimal conditions elsewhere. Pokémon preferentially graze in these fields when given choices, seeming to recognize the superior quality. Soil analysis reveals nothing extraordinary, showing typical composition and mineral content that shouldn't produce exceptional results. Moving forests demonstrate the most bewildering natural mystery, entire groves that relocate slowly over years, advancing meters annually in consistent directions. Trees in these forests show no signs of replanting or individual movement, yet careful surveying confirms that forest boundaries shift gradually but definitely. Pokémon populations within the forests move with the trees, maintaining territories that travel with the forest's progression. Scientists monitoring these forests document the movement, but cannot explain the mechanism, allowing stationary trees to change locations. Paths through certain woods reconfigure between visits, familiar trails leading to different destinations, despite travelers beginning from identical starting points. Landmarks that should guide navigation appear in wrong positions or fail to appear at all, creating disorientation that affects even experienced hikers. Pokémon guide the lost travelers with apparent ease, leading them through the altered paths to intended destinations. The forests return to normal configurations unpredictably, with paths resuming expected routes without explanation for their temporary alterations. Clearings appear where they shouldn't exist, open spaces surrounded by mature forest with no evidence of the logging or natural events that would create such gaps. These clearings contain soil identical to surrounding forest floor, showing no burning or recent disturbance. Pokémon treat these clearings as territory boundaries, with multiple species maintaining adjacent territories that meet at the clearing's edges without overlapping. The clearing's sizes remain stable, neither expanding through succession nor shrinking as forest encroaches. Waterfalls occasionally reverse their flow, with water climbing upward for brief periods before resuming normal descent. These reversals occur without warning and last unpredictable durations, sometimes mere seconds, and occasionally sustained for hours. Pokémon swimming in affected pools adapt instantly to flow reversals, adjusting their swimming to maintain position regardless of current direction. The reversals appear random, showing no correlation with lunar phases, weather patterns, or seismic activity that might influence water behavior. Rivers split around islands that weren't present previously, waterways suddenly diverging to accommodate land masses that appeared overnight. These islands feature vegetation that matches surrounding riverbanks, suggesting rapid transplantation or materialization of fully formed ecosystems. Pokémon inhabit these islands immediately after they appear, taking up residence as though the land had always existed. The islands remain permanently, becoming fixed features that maps must be updated to include. Lakes change depth dramatically between seasons, transforming from shallow pools to profound basins that require advanced diving equipment to reach bottom. These depth changes occur without corresponding changes in water volume, suggesting that lake bottoms are rising and falling rather than water levels fluctuating. Pokémon populations shift with these changes, with deep water species appearing during deep phases and shallow water species during shallow periods. The cycling follows no predictable pattern, making it impossible to anticipate when depths will shift. Underground rivers flow through caverns that connect distant regions, providing aquatic highways that allow water Pokémon to travel hundreds of kilometers beneath surface terrain. These rivers maintain stable flows despite lacking obvious water sources or outlets, circulating through networks that defy conventional hydrology. Pokémon using these routes emerge at destinations with remarkable precision, suggesting either excellent navigation abilities or inherent knowledge of the network's layout that allows targeted travel. Springs that produce different types of water from adjacent outlets present another hydrological mystery, with one spring flowing cold water while its neighbor produces hot water, or one running clear while another runs mineral-rich and colored. The springs share underground sources based on geological surveys, yet somehow separate different water characteristics before emergence. Pokémon show strong preferences for specific springs, with some species exclusively drinking from cold sources while others favor hot or mineral variants. Gravity seems to lose consistency in certain mountain regions, creating zones where falls feel slower and jumps reach impossible heights. These areas allow visitors to leap multiple times their normal jumping height, landing gently despite extended airtime. Pokémon native to these regions show adaptations that take advantage of the altered physics, developing enhanced jumping abilities that function even outside the zones. The boundaries between normal and altered gravity areas are precisely definable, creating invisible thresholds where weight suddenly changes. Magnetic fields in specific caves create levitation zones where metallic objects hover freely without support. These fields exhibit properties unlike any electromagnetic phenomena documented elsewhere, affecting only certain materials while leaving others unaffected. Pokémon with steel typing experience buoyancy in these zones, floating effortlessly through passages that would normally require climbing. The fields remain stable over decades, suggesting permanent magnetic structures deep within the mountain bedrock. Paths that slope steeply upward feel level to climbers, creating sensory distortions that make difficult ascents seem effortless. Travelers report feeling no exertion despite elevation gains that should cause significant fatigue. The illusion breaks at path endpoints, where accurate perception suddenly returns and climbers realize the distances they've covered. Pokémon in these areas move with consistent energy expenditure, apparently immune to the perceptual effects that confuse humans. Stones that float in certain quarries hover at fixed heights above the ground, maintaining stable positions despite nothing physical supporting them. These floating stones can be pushed horizontally but resist vertical movement, snapping back to their original heights when force is removed. Pokémon sometimes nest atop the floating stones, using them as elevated platforms that require no structural support. The quarries containing these stones show no unusual mineral compositions, leaving the levitation mechanism unexplained. Ancient battlefields, where significant conflicts occurred centuries ago, still echo with sounds of combat during specific conditions, faint but distinct clangs of weapons and muffled shouts that seem to come from nowhere. These auditory phenomena occur most frequently during weather conditions that match historical accounts of the battles, suggesting atmospheric patterns might trigger latent energy imprinted during the events. Pokémon generally avoid these sites during echo occurrences, becoming anxious if forced to remain in the area. Buildings reported as haunted display phenomena that resist standard explanations, furniture moving without physical contact, doors closing despite no wind or human intervention, and temperature drops that create zones of intense cold. Scientific investigation reveals no mechanisms for the observed events, yet multiple witnesses document identical experiences across years. Pokémon reactions vary, with some species fleeing these locations, while others appear comfortable and even protective of the spaces. Photographs taken at specific locations show figures or Pokémon that weren't visible during capture, images appearing in developed photos that photographers swear weren't present in the actual scene. These photographic anomalies occur consistently at the same sites, suggesting whatever causes them is locationally bound rather than random. Digital photography shows the same phenomena, ruling out film processing as the explanation. Pokémon sometimes appear to look directly at the positions where anomalies later appear in photos, hinting they perceive whatever presences cameras capture. Voices whisper in certain ruins during specific times, speaking languages that don't match any known dialect, despite clear articulation. The voices don't repeat, instead seeming to engage in conversations or deliver monologues that extend for minutes. Recording equipment captures these voices with unusual clarity, though translation attempts fail due to the unique linguistic structures. Pokémon react to the voices with attention, but not alarm, suggesting the presences don't threaten, but simply exist alongside living creatures. Cold spots form in haunted locations, creating temperature zones significantly below ambient readings without identifiable cooling sources. These cold spots remain stationary, maintaining fixed positions within rooms or passages. Visitors standing in cold spots report emotional shifts, often feeling melancholic or nostalgic despite no personal connection to the locations. Pokémon with ice typing are drawn to these spots, seemingly drawing energy from the mysterious cold. Objects move without explanation in houses with reported activity, items relocating between rooms or rearranging themselves into patterns that feel intentional. These movements occur without sound, with objects found in new positions without any indication of how they arrived there. Pokémon living in these houses treat the movements as normal, showing no surprise when objects appear in unexpected locations. Some trainers report that asking politely for specific items sometimes results in those items appearing in accessible spots. Doors in old buildings open and close, following patterns that suggest intention rather than mechanical failure or environmental factors. The doors move at consistent speeds, never slamming but closing firmly. Attempts to secure these doors with locks or barriers prove temporary, with the doors resuming their movement patterns once restraints are removed. Pokémon pass through these doors without hesitation, timing their movement to coordinate with the door's opening cycles. Footsteps echo through empty corridors in buildings where no one walks. Distinct sounds of feet on various surfaces proceeding along specific routes. The footsteps maintain consistent pace and direction, following paths that correspond to hallways or stairs, despite nothing visible creating the sounds. These footsteps occur at predictable times, allowing residents to anticipate their occurrence. Pokémon sometimes follow alongside the invisible walkers, matching pace and appearing to track movement that humans cannot perceive. Lights flicker in patterns that exceed random electrical fluctuation, creating rhythms that observers sometimes interpret as communication attempts. The patterns repeat across multiple occurrences, suggesting deliberate signaling rather than mechanical failures. Electrician inspections reveal no wiring faults or power irregularities that would explain the flickering. Pokémon with electric abilities sometimes interact with flickering lights, seeming to respond to the patterns with their own light emissions or vocalizations. Breathless moments occur when the atmosphere itself seems to pause, creating seconds where ambient sound stops and everything becomes preternaturally still. These moments happen without warning, affecting areas ranging from single rooms to entire hillsides. Pokémon freeze during these pauses, becoming statues until normal time resumes. Trainers experiencing these moments report that they remain aware and able to move, though the stillness creates profound psychological impact that persists long after the moment ends. Precognitive dreams trouble some trainers, detailed visions of future events that later manifest with uncanny accuracy. These dreams often involve Pokémon or locations the dreamer hasn't encountered, yet subsequent experiences match dream content precisely. Some dreamers develop reputations as seers, with communities consulting them about future events despite scientific skepticism. Pokémon owned by frequent dreamers sometimes react to situations as though they've experienced them before, suggesting the precognitive connection might extend beyond the trainer. Déjà vu experiences occur with unusual frequency in certain locations, creating persistent feelings that visitors have experienced current moments in past visits, despite never having been in the area previously. These feelings extend beyond vague recognition to include specific details that visitors shouldn't know but prove accurate upon a verification. Pokémon in these locations sometimes pause as though experiencing similar recognition, stopping to examine surroundings with apparent confusion before continuing normally. Shared visions affect multiple people simultaneously, with groups of trainers reporting identical hallucinations or dreams despite being separated by distance. These shared experiences include enough of specific detail to rule out coincidence, featuring conversations, Pokémon species, and locations that all participants recall identically. The visions sometimes precede actual events, creating situations where multiple witnesses knew outcomes before they occurred. Researchers studying these phenomena find no neurological or psychological explanations for the synchronization. Time slips transport individuals momentarily into past or future versions of locations, creating brief experiences of areas as they existed in different eras. These slips last seconds to minutes before reality snaps back to the present, leaving those affected disoriented but certain of what they witnessed. Details observed during slips sometimes provide historical information later verified through research, suggesting the experiences access actual temporal periods rather than imagination or hallucination. Pokémon accompanying travelers during time slips appear unaffected, maintaining normal behavior throughout the displacement. Certain Pokémon bonds transcend normal training relationships, creating connections where trainers and Pokémon share emotions or thoughts despite physical separation. Partners in these bonds report feeling their Pokémon's pain or joy regardless of distance, experiencing echoes of their partner's experiences in real time. These bonds form spontaneously rather than through training techniques, appearing in some partnerships while remaining absent in others despite similar care and attention. Pokémon in these bonds sometimes anticipate their trainer's needs before any command is given, responding to intention rather than instruction. Telepathic moments occur between specific Pokémon and trainers, creating instant understanding without vocalization or gesture. These moments feel qualitatively different from simple empathy or intuition, carrying clear semantic content that both partners recognize as communication. The telepathy remains unreliable, manifesting during emotionally intense situations, but resisting deliberate invocation. Some trainer Pokémon pairs develop this ability over years of partnership, while others experience it from first meeting, suggesting individual variation in telepathic compatibility. Shared dreams between trainers and their Pokémon create matched experiences where both parties recall identical dream content upon waking. These dreams often feature symbolic representations of training challenges or emotional issues affecting the partnership, providing insight that influences waking decisions. The dreams occur without planning, appearing spontaneously, and leaving both participants with clear memories of the shared experience. Some pairs use these dreams as problem-solving tools, deliberately sleeping near each other with the hope of entering shared dream space. Emotional echoes allow Pokémon to sense their trainers' feelings from great distances, reacting to emotional states despite physical separation that should prevent normal detection. Pokémon, hundreds of kilometers from their trainers, sometimes become agitated during emergencies or celebratory during triumphs, responding as though they felt their trainers' emotions directly. These connections work bidirectionally, with trainers sometimes experiencing sudden mood shifts that match their Pokémon's current emotional states. Healing phenomena occur when certain trainers touch injured Pokémon, accelerating recovery beyond normal rates without medical intervention. The healing appears instinctive rather than trained, manifesting in crisis, situations where trainers desperately wish to help their partners. Medical analysis shows genuine physiological changes in healed Pokémon, including accelerated cell regeneration and reduced inflammation. The ability remains inconsistent, working powerfully in some instances while having no effect in others, frustrating attempts to study the mechanism systematically. Crystals in specific caves grow in formation that suggest intentional design rather than natural crystallization, creating geometric patterns too perfect for random mineral deposition. These crystals maintain precise alignment with each other, creating arrays that span entire chambers with mathematical precision. Some crystals pulse with faint light, synchronized across the entire formation, creating waves of illumination that travel through the array. Pokémon sometimes interact with these crystals in ritualistic ways, touching specific points in sequence as though performing learned behaviors. Resonance chambers exist, where sound waves interact in ways that create standing harmonics, sustained notes that persist without continuous input. These chambers amplify specific frequencies while dampening others, creating environments where certain tones ring with unusual clarity. Pokémon vocalizing in these chambers seem to understand the acoustic properties, producing calls that leverage the resonance to achieve maximum effect. Humans singing or chanting in resonance chambers report experiencing altered consciousness states, with the sustained harmonics producing the meditative or euphoric sensations. Ancient instruments left in ruins sometimes produce sounds when wind passes through or when touched, playing melodies that feel more intentional than random. The instruments remain playable despite age, showing no deterioration that would prevent their use. The melodies they produce vary, but maintain musical coherence, suggesting they were designed to sound pleasant regardless of how they're activated. Pokémon react strongly to these melodies, sometimes gathering to listen when the instruments sound. Power nodes exist where multiple energy types converge, creating nexus points that measure higher than surrounding areas across various metrics. These nodes affect Pokémon behavior, with creatures gathering at the nodes during specific times. Training conducted at power nodes sometimes produces accelerated results, with Pokémon learning moves or evolving faster than normal rates suggest should be possible. The nodes' positions correlate with geological features, appearing at mountain peaks, valley centers, or coastal promontories where natural energies concentrate. Magnetic mountains create compass confusion across wide areas, rendering normal navigation impossible. The mountains contain iron deposits far exceeding typical concentrations, creating magnetic fields strong enough to deflect compass needles and disrupt electronic equipment. Pokémon, with magnetic sensitivity use these mountains as landmarks, navigating by the magnetic distortions rather than being confused by them. The mountain's influence extends underground, affecting minerals and surrounding areas and creating extensive zones of altered magnetic properties. Geothermal vents release energy that Pokémon absorb directly, using the volcanic heat as a power source that enhances abilities or accelerates healing. These vents attract fire and rock type Pokémon naturally, but other species also visit them during recovery from injury or illness. The absorbed energy produces visible effects, with Pokémon glowing faintly or displaying increased body temperature after extended exposure. Researchers studying these vents have documented measurable increases in Pokémon vitality metrics following vent visits. Underground currents of unknown energy flow through certain regions, detectable by instruments but not identifiable as any known energy type. These currents follow stable paths that don't change over observation periods, creating invisible rivers of energy beneath surface terrain. Pokémon sense these currents, using them as guidance for underground travel or territory establishment. Some species build nests or burrows directly above strong current flows, suggesting the energy provides benefits beyond navigation. Stars arrange themselves into patterns that observers interpret as representing Pokémon shapes, constellations that cultures across regions identify independently. These stellar patterns appear consistent when viewed from any location, suggesting they represent actual spatial arrangements rather than perspective-dependent formations. Ancient civilizations named these constellations after Pokémon species that held cultural significance, creating celestial catalogs that astronomers still reference. Some patterns shift slightly over centuries, moving in ways that suggest the stars composing them share coordinated motion. Meteor impacts in ancient eras left sites where unusual minerals concentrate, creating deposits of materials with properties that enhance Pokémon abilities or accelerate evolution. These impact sites remain identifiable by unique geological features, with crater formations persisting millions of years after the initial collisions. Pokémon populations near impact sites sometimes show genetic variations absent in same species populations elsewhere, suggesting the unusual minerals influenced evolutionary development. Some rare Pokémon species exist exclusively near impact sites, raising questions about whether meteors carried organisms that adapted to planetary conditions, or whether impacts created environmental niches that allowed specialization. Auroras at extreme latitudes display colors that shouldn't occur in natural aurora phenomena, including shades of purple and gold that don't correspond to known atmospheric ionization patterns. These unusual auroras appear during quiet solar periods when normal auroras shouldn't manifest, suggesting causes beyond solar wind interaction. Pokémon in polar regions treat aurora displays as significant events, gathering to watch the lights with behaviors that suggest ceremonial importance. Some indigenous communities believe these auroras carry messages from ancient spirits or serve as portals to other realms. Cosmic radiation in certain regions exceeds expected levels without identifiable sources, creating zones of enhanced background radiation that persist despite lacking astronomical events to explain them. Pokémon in these zones show resistance to radiation effects, suggesting evolutionary adaptation to the enhanced environment. Plants in affected areas sometimes display unusual growth characteristics, including bioluminescence or accelerated maturation. Scientists monitor these zones closely, studying whether the radiation stems from terrestrial sources or represents cosmic influences that current models don't account for. Solar eclipses trigger mass behaviors that suggest Pokémon perceive eclipses as significant beyond their visual spectacle. Nocturnal species emerge during daytime totality, while diurnal species retreat as though night had fallen. The transition happens with uncanny precision, with behavioral shifts beginning seconds before visible eclipse phases and reversing immediately upon totality's end. Some Pokémon species vocalize during eclipses, producing calls that differ from their normal communication patterns and suggesting eclipse-specific behaviors inherited through generations. Lunar effects on Pokémon behavior extend beyond monthly cycles, with some species responding to lunar eclipses, supermoons, and blue moons with distinct behaviors not seen during normal full moons. These lunar events prompt migrations, breeding activities, or gathering behaviors that occur exclusively during these specific phenomena. The precision of these responses implies biological clocks capable of tracking complex astronomical patterns, suggesting either inherited knowledge spanning generations or sensitivity to subtle environmental cues that correlate with lunar events. Ancient observatories built by unknown civilizations align with astronomical events with precision that challenges explanations of primitive technology. These structures track solstices, equinoxes, and planetary alignments through stone arrangements that function as accurate calendars despite being constructed millennia before modern astronomy developed. Some observatories include features that appear designed to track specific stars or constellations no longer visible from their locations due to axial precession, suggesting the structures are far older than geological dating indicates or were designed by people with sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Celestial navigation abilities in migrating Pokémon demonstrate awareness of star patterns that allows precise directional sense, regardless of weather or time. These creatures orient themselves using stellar references, maintaining course accuracy that surpasses technological navigation systems. Young Pokémon display these abilities instinctively without learning from parents, indicating innate knowledge of celestial mechanics. The precision of this navigation suggests Pokémon perceive more astronomical information than visible starlight provides, possibly sensing magnetic fields, gravitational influences, or other cosmic factors humans cannot detect without instruments. Islands appear and disappear with tidal patterns, revealing themselves only during specific lunar phases before submerging again. These vanishing islands follow predictable schedules that careful observers can track, allowing brief visits during emergence periods. The islands feature unique ecosystems adapted to cyclic submersion, with plants and Pokémon capable of surviving both exposed and underwater conditions. Some islands contain structures or artifacts suggesting permanent habitation in eras when sea levels stood lower, raising questions about lost civilizations that thrived before modern oceanic configurations. Shorelines shift position between visits, with beaches extending or retreating by significant distances without corresponding changes in tide or sea level. These shifts occur most dramatically in areas with reported temporal anomalies, suggesting connection between spatial instability and time distortions. Pokémon populations adjust to these shifts without difficulty, relocating nests and territories to accommodate the changing geography. The shifts follow no predictable pattern, making coastal mapping frustrating for cartographers attempting to create stable reference materials. Whirlpools form in locations without bathymetric features that should create such phenomena, appearing in deep water far from shallow areas or irregularities that typically generate circular currents. These whirlpools vary in size and duration, some persisting for hours, while others last only minutes. Pokémon approach these whirlpools deliberately, sometimes entering them and vanishing beneath the surface before emerging at different locations, suggesting the whirlpools serve as transportation mechanisms rather than simple hydrological phenomena. Tidal patterns in enclosed bays follow rhythms that don't match oceanic tides, creating independent cycles that suggest influences beyond lunar gravity. These irregular tides make harbors in affected bays challenging to navigate, requiring local knowledge to predict water levels. Pokémon in these bays time their activities to the unique tidal patterns, feeding or breeding according to the bay's specific rhythm rather than regional tidal tables. The mechanism driving these independent tides remains unclear, with no obvious source for the water movements. Salt deposits in certain areas form shapes too geometric for natural crystallization, creating patterns of squares, triangles, and more complex polygons across evaporation flats. These shapes remain stable across seasons, persisting even as new salt deposits cover old formations. Pokémon avoid stepping on the geometric salt formations, walking around them despite the detours required. Some researchers propose that underground features influence crystallization patterns, while others suggest unknown organisms create the formations deliberately. Underwater ruins present challenges to historical understanding, displaying architecture that requires significant engineering knowledge, yet supposedly predating civilizations with such capabilities. These structures sit at depths suggesting they were built before sea levels rose to current heights, implying construction occurred during ice ages when more land area existed. The ruins contain artifacts that resist dating, showing preservation impossible for their supposed ages. Pokémon inhabit these ruins extensively, using chambers and passages as dens and breeding grounds, treating the structures as natural features of the ocean floor. Ice caves exist within glaciers, featuring passages that remain stable despite the flowing nature of glacier ice. These caves should collapse or deform as glacial movement occurs, yet they maintain structural integrity across decades. The ice composing the walls displays unusual crystalline structure, showing organization that differs from normal glacial ice. Pokémon adapted to cold environments navigate these caves freely, using them as shelters and hunting grounds where they find prey species that also inhabit the stable passages. Ice cores drilled from ancient ice sheets contain pockets of atmosphere trapped during previous geological epochs, preserving air samples that reveal past atmospheric compositions. Analysis of these samples shows oxygen and carbon dioxide levels varying significantly from current values, confirming climate fluctuations across deep time. Some cores contain microorganisms frozen in preservation, organisms that revive when thawed after millennia of dormancy. These discoveries suggest life persists through environmental extremes that should prove fatal, raising questions about whether similar organisms exist in other extreme environments, like in underground aquifers or volcanic vents. Frozen Pokémon occasionally emerge from melting glaciers, perfectly preserved specimens that lived thousands of years before present. These discoveries provide unprecedented glimpses into prehistoric ecosystems, showing how ancient Pokémon differed from modern descendants. The frozen specimens sometimes carry parasites, gut contents, or other biological materials that inform understanding of ancient food webs and environmental conditions. Attempts to extract viable genetic material have produced ambiguous results, with some researchers claiming successful extraction, while others insist the DNA is too degraded for meaningful analysis. Ancient frozen forests emerge as glaciers retreat, revealing preserved trees that lived during previous climate regimes. These forests contain wood samples that inform climate reconstruction, with growth rings recording temperature and precipitation patterns from millennia past. The preserved forests attract scientific attention not just for climate data, but for the Pokémon remains occasionally found among the trees, suggesting diverse species inhabited regions now covered by ice. Some trees contain seeds that researchers attempt to germinate, hoping to revive plant species that haven't grown for thousands of years. Gravity wells appear where localized gravity intensifies beyond normal planetary pull, creating spots where objects feel heavier and movement requires increased effort. These wells fluctuate in strength, sometimes barely detectable, and other times strong enough to prevent jumping or make standing difficult. Pokémon seem to anticipate gravity changes, avoiding wells when they strengthen and investigating them during weak phases. The wells cluster in areas with reported dimensional thinness, suggesting connection between gravity anomalies and reality boundaries. Magnetic reversals detected in rock formations show that planetary magnetic field has flipped polarity numerous times throughout geological history. These reversals occurred at irregular intervals, with some epochs showing stable polarity for millions of years, while others experienced frequent flips. The mechanisms driving reversals remain poorly understood, with competing theories proposing different core dynamics. Some researchers study how Pokémon dependent on magnetic navigation responded to historical reversals, questioning whether species went extinct during field transitions or possessed adaptable navigation systems that functioned regardless of polarity. Energy sinks exist where introduced energy dissipates faster than thermodynamics predicts, creating zones where light dims, sound dampens, and heat cools at accelerated rates. These sinks affect all energy types, suggesting fundamental alterations to local physics rather than isolated phenomenon. Pokémon expend increased energy while within sinks, tiring faster and requiring more food to maintain activity levels. The sinks maintain fixed positions, creating invisible boundaries where energy behavior changes abruptly. Levitation spots scatter throughout various regions, small areas where downward force reduces enough to allow jumping to heights impossible elsewhere. These spots enable tricks and acrobatics that appear gravity-defying, with visitors leaping multiple times their normal jump height and experiencing slow falls upon landing. Pokémon indigenous to levitation areas show adaptations that take advantage of the reduced gravity, developing enhanced jumping abilities that function even outside the spots. The spots remain stable, creating reliable locations for training jump-dependent moves or simply enjoying unusual physics. Dimensional rifts create brief windows between worlds, parallel realities, openings through which glimpses of alternate worlds become visible. These rifts appear randomly, lasting seconds before closing, making systematic study extremely difficult. The glimpses sometimes show familiar landscapes altered in subtle ways, while other times revealing completely foreign environments. Pokémon occasionally pass through rifts, vanishing from sight, before sometimes returning with behaviors suggesting they experienced the other side. Some rifts appear to lead to past or future versions of the same location, rather than truly alternate dimensions. Parallel spaces overlap with normal reality in thin spots, creating regions where careful observers notice minor inconsistencies that suggest multiple realities coexisting. These overlaps manifest as objects appearing in slightly different positions than remembered, or familiar locations feeling less subtly wrong without obvious changes. Pokémon sensitive to spatial distortions react to overlaps with confusion or agitation, suggesting they perceive the dimensional layering more acutely than humans. Some theorists propose these overlaps explain various mysteries, attributing disappeared objects, altered memories, and anomalous phenomena to temporary dimension blending. Reality bubbles form where normal physics suspends temporarily, creating isolated pockets where different rules apply. These bubbles might alter gravity, change how light propagates, or modify time flow for brief periods before popping and returning to normal. Pokémon caught in bubbles during formation sometimes emerge confused, having experienced time differently than external observers. The bubbles appear without warning, making them unpredictable and occasionally dangerous when they affect travelers mid-journey. Pocket dimensions exist as small reality pockets, accessible through specific locations. Spaces larger inside than outside measurements suggest possible. These pockets sometimes serve as natural shelter for Pokémon, providing areas where groups can live comfortably, despite the entrance being small enough to barely squeeze through. Some pockets contain complete ecosystems, implying they've existed for extended periods and developed independently from surrounding regions. The mechanisms creating and sustaining pocket dimensions remain theoretical, with competing explanations ranging from quantum physics to ancient reality manipulation technology. Mirror worlds accessible through certain reflective surfaces create parallel spaces that mirror normal reality with subtle differences. Travelers entering mirror worlds report that everything feels reversed, not just left-right, but in deeper ways, including emotional tones or behavioral norms. Pokémon in mirror worlds sometimes exhibit inverted personality traits, with normally aggressive species acting docile and typically shy creatures showing boldness. Exiting mirror worlds requires finding the corresponding exit point, which doesn't always match the entry location, leading to disorientation and occasional difficulty returning to normal reality. Desert sands in certain regions spontaneously transform into glass overnight, creating scattered glass formations without evidence of lightning strikes or fires that typically cause such transformation. The glass forms in artistic shapes, curves, and spirals that feel intentional rather than random. Pokémon avoid newly formed glass while it remains warm, but later use the formations as landmarks and territory markers. Scientists studying the formations find no explanation for the heat source required to melt sand into glass, suggesting either unknown energy releases or processes beyond current understanding. Spiraling pollen clouds form in forests near ancient ruins, creating perfect helical patterns that remain stable despite wind. The pollen moves in coordination, thousands of individual particles maintaining formation for extended periods. These spirals mirror celestial mechanics, rotating at rates matching planetary motion, as though the pollen responds to gravitational influences. Pokémon gather beneath spirals, watching the rotations with focused attention that suggests understanding or appreciation of the phenomenon. Reflective ponds show past or future scenes in their surfaces during specific lunar phases, displaying events that aren't occurring in present time. These visions appear as clear images in the water, persisting long enough for detailed observation before fading. Some witnesses believe they've seen prophecies or historical events, while skeptics attribute the visions to pareidolia or illusion. Pokémon drinking from these ponds afterward show increased serenity, suggesting the water contains properties beyond simple hydration. Rhythmic tapping deep within certain caves creates the heartbeat-like sounds that persist constantly. The tapping originates from depths beyond exploration, maintaining steady tempo that never varies. Pokémon press against cave walls as though listening, sometimes humming in harmony with the tapping. Attempts to track the sound source lead researchers in circles, suggesting the tapping doesn't originate from a fixed point, but somehow pervades the entire cave system. Frozen lightning manifests during intense storms, bolts that pause mid-strike before completing their discharge. These suspended bolts remain visible for seconds, hanging motionless before continuing downward. Pokémon witnessing this phenomenon react with reverence rather than fear, making vocalizations that sound celebratory. Some observers claim the suspended lightning forms runic shapes, though the briefness of the suspension makes verification difficult. Breathless moments occur when the world collectively pauses, air stilling, and sound ceasing for seconds before normal conditions return. These moments affect wide areas, with reports from different locations describing simultaneous experiences of the pause. Pokémon freeze during these moments, becoming perfectly still regardless of previous activity. Trainers describe the pauses as feeling significant, creating impressions of being present during something important, even though nothing obviously changes. Through all these mysteries, vanishing civilizations and fossil gaps, ocean depths and migration mysteries, temporal anomalies and gathering behaviors, urban secrets and legend fragments, energy anomalies and electromagnetic strangeness, dimensional thinness and weather rebellion, silence zones and acoustic wonders, stone tones and sensory chambers, meditation marks and crystal glows, bioluminescent gardens and glowing springs, pulsing mushrooms and firefly dances, colored mists and shadow independence, reflection impossibilities and still pools, volcanic ice and sourceless heat, impossible blooms and ancient trees, eternal fruit and exceptional grain, moving forests and reconfiguring paths, spontaneous clearings and reverse, waterfalls, appearing islands and shifting lakes, underground highways and variable springs, gravity zones and magnetic caverns, level slopes and floating stones, battlefield echoes and building hauntings, photographic anomalies and whispering ruins, cold presences and moving objects, closing doors and invisible footsteps, patterned lights and breathless pauses, precognitive dreams and frequent déjà vu, shared visions and time slips, transcendent bonds and telepathic moments, shared dreams and emotional echoes, healing touch and crystal arrays, resonance chambers and ancient instruments, power nodes and magnetic mountains, geothermal absorption and underground currents, stellar patterns and meteor impacts, aurora anomalies and cosmic radiation, eclipse triggers and lunar behaviors, ancient observatories and stellar navigation, vanishing islands and shifting shores, deliberate whirlpools and independent tides, geometric salt and underwater ruins, stable ice caves and ancient cores, frozen specimens and preserved forests, gravity wells and magnetic reversals, energy sinks and levitation spots, dimensional rifts and parallel overlaps, reality bubbles and pocket dimensions, mirror worlds and glass sands, spiraling pollen and reflective ponds, underground heartbeats and frozen lightning. All these quiet mysteries woven through every region demonstrate that the Pokémon world speaks in whispers that only patience can hear, and the gentle truth emerges that mystery is not absence of knowledge, but presence of wonder, a soft, ancient language that Pokémon understand instinctively, while humans can only grasp through stillness and attention. And in these unexplained moments lies the comfort that some truths remain forever beyond complete understanding, drifting through the world like evening mist, wrapping all who notice in peaceful acceptance of what cannot be fully known. Mysterious behaviors in domestic Pokémon suggest depths to common species that casual observation misses. Household companions sometimes stare at empty corners for extended periods, tracking movements invisible to human eyes. Their focus remains absolute, pupils dilating or narrowing as though watching something move through space. When questioned through subsequent behavior analysis, these Pokémon show no signs of distress or playfulness, simply observation of phenomena their senses detect, but human perception cannot access. Sleep patterns in Pokémon vary wildly between species, with some requiring only minutes of rest, while others sleep for days. The mechanisms governing these differences remain poorly understood, with no clear correlation between size, type, or activity level and sleep needs. Some Pokémon demonstrate ability to remain conscious during sleep, maintaining awareness of surroundings while their bodies rest. This divided consciousness allows them to respond to threats while recovering, suggesting neural structures fundamentally different from human brain architecture. Dreams in Pokémon manifest visibly through slight movements, vocalizations, or energy emissions during sleep. Psychic types sometimes project dream content into nearby minds, creating shared experience where observers witness the sleeping Pokémon's dream narrative. These projections occur involuntarily, suggesting that psychic abilities operate even during unconscious states. The dreams often feature abstract imagery or scenarios impossible in waking reality, raising questions about whether Pokémon dream symbolically or experience alternate consciousness states during sleep. Memory formation in Pokémon demonstrates capabilities that exceed human neurological models. Species with tiny brains display complex learned behaviors that should require more neural tissue than they possess. Some Pokémon remember precise details from events occurring years earlier, recalling specific individuals or locations encountered briefly during their youth. This enhanced memory suggests either more efficient information storage or alternative memory mechanisms that don't rely solely on brain structure. Language comprehension among Pokémon varies remarkably, with some individuals understanding complex human speech while others respond only to simple commands. The variation occurs within species, indicating that language ability depends on individual intelligence or environmental exposure rather than genetic capability alone. Certain Pokémon learn to communicate through human writing systems, creating messages by arranging objects or drawing symbols. These literate individuals demonstrate abstract thinking that challenges assumptions about animal intelligence. Tool use appears sporadically across multiple Pokémon species, with the individuals improvising implements to solve problems. Some species pass tool techniques through generations, creating cultural traditions of tool employment that vary between populations. The tools remain simple, sticks for reaching, food or stones for cracking shells, but their use demonstrates planning and causal reasoning. Observers note that tool-using Pokémon often teach techniques to younger individuals, suggesting intentional knowledge transmission rather than independent discovery. Problem-solving abilities manifest differently across types, with psychic Pokémon favoring mental approaches while fighting types prefer physical solutions. This specialization suggests that type influences cognitive style, shaping how Pokémon approach challenges. Cross-type collaborations sometimes produce novel solutions that neither type would achieve independently, indicating that diverse perspectives benefit group problem-solving even among non-human species. Social structures in wild populations create hierarchies that determine access to resources and mating opportunities. These hierarchies establish through competitions that test strength, intelligence, or endurance depending on species values. Some species maintain stable hierarchies for extended periods, while others reassess rankings regularly through fresh contests. The social dynamics influence individual behavior profoundly, with subordinate Pokémon displaying deference and dominant individuals showing increased confidence. Mating rituals incorporate elaborate displays that advertise fitness and genetic quality. These displays range from visual demonstrations of plumage or coloration to acoustic performances or competitive contests. Some species construct elaborate structures or gather valuable items to impress potential mates, investments that require significant time and energy. The specificity of preferences within species creates selective pressures that drive evolution toward exaggerated traits. Parental care varies from species that abandon eggs immediately after laying to those that raise offspring through multiple developmental stages. The variation correlates loosely with offspring vulnerability, with species producing hardy young providing less care than those bearing fragile hatchlings. Some Pokémon demonstrate teaching behaviors, deliberately exposing young to controlled challenges that build skills necessary for independence. These teaching methods sometimes appear remarkably sophisticated, suggesting that parental Pokémon understand developmental progression and adjust instruction accordingly. Pack dynamics in species that hunt or forage cooperatively create specialized roles that maximize group efficiency. Individuals develop expertise in scouting, tracking, or combat, contributing unique skills to collective efforts. The specialization sometimes appears innate, with young Pokémon gravitating toward roles matching their natural aptitudes, while other times develops through experience and practice. Successful packs maintain balance between specialists, ensuring they possess all capabilities needed for survival. Migration timing demonstrates precision that implies sophisticated temporal awareness. Species that migrate annually begin journeys within days of optimal departure windows, accounting for weather patterns and resource availability at distant destinations. The timing coordination across populations suggests either inherited knowledge passed genetically or environmental cues that trigger departure simultaneously across wide areas. Young Pokémon undertaking first migrations navigate accurately despite never having traveled the routes previously, raising questions about how directional information transfers between generations. Hibernation in certain species involves metabolic slowdown so profound that breathing and heartbeat become nearly undetectable. These dormant Pokémon survive months without food or water, living off stored reserves while maintaining body temperature barely above freezing. The metabolic suspension requires physiological adaptations that prevent cellular damage during extended inactivity. Some hibernating species can rouse briefly if disturbed before returning to dormancy, while others remain unconscious regardless of external stimuli. Territorial behaviors range from passive occupation to aggressive defense, with methods varying by species temperament and resource value. Some Pokémon mark territories with scent, vocalizations, or physical alterations to landscape, establishing boundaries that neighbors respect. Disputes occur when territories overlap or resources become scarce, resolved through displays, combat, or occasionally diplomatic negotiation in species capable of such communication. Territory sizes fluctuate seasonally, expanding during breeding periods when additional space ensures offspring survival. Camouflage techniques employ multiple strategies, from pigment changes that match surroundings to behavioral modifications that reduce detection. Some species remain motionless for extended periods, relying on stillness to avoid predator notice. Others adopt shapes or postures that mimic environmental features, transforming from recognizable organisms into apparent rocks, plants, or shadows. The effectiveness varies by predator visual capabilities, with techniques that fool some species failing against others with different perceptual strengths. Bioluminescence serves diverse purposes across species that produce light. Some employ it for communication, flashing patterns that convey information to conspecifics. Others use light to lure prey, creating attractive displays that draw curious creatures within striking range. Deep-sea species rely on bioluminescence for basic vision in environments devoid of sunlight, producing light to illuminate surroundings or identify others of their kind. The biochemistry underlying light production varies, with different species using distinct chemical reactions to generate photons. Regeneration abilities in certain Pokémon allow recovery from injuries that would prove fatal to other species. Lost limbs regrow over weeks or months, restoring full functionality through processes that somehow recreate complex tissues. The regeneration implies cellular programs that retain developmental information into adulthood, allowing mature organisms to essentially redevelop lost structures. Some species regenerate so completely that they can survive bisection, with both halves potentially developing into complete individuals. Aging rates differ dramatically between species, with some living mere years, while others survive for centuries. The variation doesn't correlate simply with size or complexity, suggesting that longevity results from specific physiological adaptations rather than general principles. Species that age slowly show resistance to cellular degradation, maintaining tissue function that deteriorates rapidly in short-lived species. The mechanisms underlying this differential aging might inform understanding of aging processes generally. Death in Pokémon can occur through violence, disease, or age-related decline, but some species demonstrate unusual end-of-life behaviors. Certain dying Pokémon journey to specific locations, graveyards where previous generations expired. The motivation for these death pilgrimages remains unclear, possibly representing instinctive behavior or conscious choice to die among ancestors. The graveyards accumulate remains across generations, creating sites of archaeological interest that provide insights into population dynamics and environmental history. Fossilization occurs under specific geological conditions that preserve organic material, processes requiring rapid burial and mineral-rich environments. The rarity of appropriate conditions means that most deceased Pokémon decompose without leaving fossils, creating tremendous gaps in the paleontological record. The fossils that do form sometimes preserve extraordinary detail, including soft tissues or even cellular structures that inform understanding of ancient biology. Each fossil discovery potentially represents the only known specimen of its species, making every find scientifically invaluable. Evolution mysteries deepen when examining species that demonstrate multiple branching paths, capable of evolving into distinct forms depending on conditions. The mechanisms determining which evolution path triggers remain partially understood, with factors including environmental exposure, item contact, emotional states, and random chance all playing documented roles. Some evolution methods require combinations of factors that seem impossibly specific, raising questions about how such precise requirements could develop naturally. Mega evolution introduces temporary transformations that dramatically enhance power, changes that revert after battles conclude. The transformations require special stones attuned to specific species, plus strong bonds between trainers and Pokémon. The process appears painful based on certain Pokédex descriptions, suggesting that the power increase comes at significant cost. The temporary nature prevents lasting harm, but raises ethical questions about subjecting partners to painful transformations for competitive advantage. Regional variations demonstrate that Pokémon adapt to different environments by developing distinct forms with altered types, abilities, or appearances. These variations sometimes occur over relatively brief timescales by evolutionary standards, suggesting remarkable genetic plasticity. The regional forms can differ so dramatically from their counterparts that they initially appear to be separate species, only sharing enough characteristics to reveal common ancestry under careful examination. Hybrid Pokémon have never been officially documented, yet rumors persist of creatures displaying characteristics from multiple species. If such hybrids exist, they would challenge the understanding of Pokémon genetics and reproduction. The absence of confirmed hybrids suggests strong reproductive barriers between species, possibly maintained by incompatible genetics or behavioral isolation. However, the variety of egg groups and occasional ambiguous specimens leave room for speculation about whether hybridization might occur under unusual circumstances. Legendary Pokémon occupy unique positions in ecosystem dynamics, being powerful individuals that appear immortal or nearly so. Their roles range from active environmental management to passive existence in remote locations. The rarity of these beings means they have minimal impact on evolutionary processes, yet their power ensures that their occasional interventions can dramatically reshape landscapes or redirect historical events. The relationship between legendary Pokémon and human civilization remains ambiguous, with these beings sometimes helping humanity while other times remaining distant or even hostile. Mythical Pokémon exist at the boundary between documentation and legend, creatures whose existence remains unconfirmed despite numerous reported sightings. These beings supposedly possess abilities that exceed even legendary Pokémon, with powers that blur into the miraculous. The lack of solid evidence makes the scientific study impossible, leaving mythical Pokémon in the realm of folklore and speculation. Yet the consistency of descriptions across cultures suggests that these stories might reference actual beings rather than pure imagination. Artificial Pokémon created through human technology demonstrate that life can be generated through non-natural processes. These synthetic beings function biologically like natural Pokémon, capable of battling, reproducing, and forming bonds with trainers. Their existence raises philosophical questions about the definition of life and whether artificially created organisms possess the same rights and value as those arising through natural evolution. The technology that creates artificial Pokémon remains closely guarded, preventing widespread synthesis, but ensuring the capability exists to generate novel life forms. Mutant Pokémon occasionally appear displaying unusual characteristics not present in their species generally. These mutations might involve coloration differences, ability variations, or physical structure alterations. Some mutations prove beneficial, enhancing survival or reproduction, while others impose handicaps that reduce fitness. The mutation rate in Pokémon appears higher than in many Earth organisms, possibly due to environmental factors or inherent genetic instability. Shiny Pokémon represent rare color variations that occur at consistent frequencies across species. The shininess serves no obvious functional purpose, neither helping nor hindering the affected individuals. The phenomenon appears purely aesthetic, a quirk of pigmentation genetics that produces individuals with unusual coloration. Trainers prize shiny Pokémon for their rarity, creating value from scarcity rather than any practical advantage the coloration provides. Type resistances create combat dynamics that favor certain matchups while disadvantaging others. These resistances feel game-like in their consistency, raising unanswered questions about why elemental interactions follow such predictable patterns. The type system implies underlying energy structures that govern how different forces interact, suggesting that Pokémon battles engage fundamental physics operating below observable reality. Ability inheritance follows genetic patterns that allow prediction of offspring capabilities based on parental traits. The inheritance sometimes produces offspring with abilities neither parent displayed, suggesting recessive genetics or complex trait interactions. Breeding programs exploit these patterns to produce Pokémon with desired ability combinations, creating specialized individuals optimized for specific roles. Move learning occurs through multiple mechanisms, including natural level-based acquisition, technical machine instruction, and breeding inheritance. As the variety of learning methods suggests that Pokemon brains possess remarkable plasticity, able to integrate new skills throughout life. Some moves transfer only through breeding, implying that certain abilities require developmental exposure to manifest properly. Stats variations between the individuals of the same species create performance differences that careful training can minimize, but not eliminate. These individual differences appear innate, determined at birth or hatching rather than developing through experience. Trainers seeking optimal performance focus on finding individuals with naturally superior stats, creating selective pressure that might influence wild populations if released Pokemon breed successfully. Experience accumulation somehow strengthens Pokemon through exposure to combat, a process that operates beyond simple practice effects. The strengthening occurs rapidly, with battling producing power increases that physical conditioning alone couldn't achieve. This suggests that combat triggers biological changes that enhance capabilities, possibly through stress responses or energy absorption from defeated opponents. Pokeball technology contains creatures within small devices through mechanisms that remain proprietary trade secrets. The storage appears to convert Pokemon into energy or information, reconstituting them when released. The process causes no apparent harm, with Pokemon emerging healthy and conscious after extended storage. The technology implies mastery of matter-energy conversion that should have revolutionary applications beyond creature containment, yet such applications haven't appeared publicly. Storage system networks allow transfer of digitized Pokemon across vast distances instantaneously. The transfer requires compatible computer systems, but works reliably across regions and technology generations. The fact that living beings can be digitized, transmitted, and reconstituted without degradation or identity loss has profound implications for consciousness and material existence. Yet trainers use the system casually, treating it as convenient rather than philosophically troubling. Trading effects trigger evolution in species that won't transform through normal means, suggesting that the transfer process itself provides whatever stimulus these species require. The mechanism might involve energy exposure during digitization or psychological impact of ownership change, though neither explanation fully satisfies. The requirement creates social pressure, encouraging interaction between trainers, making trading essential for Pokédex completion. Pokédex entries contain information whose accuracy sometimes proves questionable, with descriptions including claims that seem exaggerated or physically impossible. The entries supposedly compile research from multiple sources, yet contradictions between generations raise questions about verification processes. Some entries describe abilities that careful observation never confirms, while others understate capabilities that field research reveals. The Pokédex remains the primary documentation source despite these accuracy concerns. Professor networks across regions maintain communication that allows collaborative research on Pokémon biology, ecology, and behavior. These researchers share findings through conferences and publications, building collective understanding that no individual could achieve alone. The professors serve as starting points for new trainers, providing initial Pokémon and equipment while also furthering scientific knowledge through data collection from journeying trainers. Gym systems create standardized challenges that test trainers' abilities while providing training opportunities. The gyms specialize by type, creating themed battles that require specific strategies to overcome. The system serves both to evaluate trainer competence and to encourage diversification of team composition, ensuring trainers don't over-rely on single Pokémon or strategies. Elite Four institutions represent peak competitive challenges, requiring trainers to defeat 4 consecutive specialized opponents without rest. The structure tests endurance and preparation, favoring trainers with balanced teams capable of handling diverse threats. Victory over the Elite Four marks trainers as among the most skilled in their region, a designation that opens opportunities for advanced competition or research collaboration. Champion status represents the pinnacle of training achievement, granted only to individuals who overcome all regional challenges, including Elite Four defeat. Champions serve as role models and often take on ambassadorial duties representing their regions. The turnover rate for champion positions varies by region, with some maintaining stable championships, while others see frequent challenges and title changes. Contest systems provide alternative competition, emphasizing aesthetics, performance, and creativity over pure combat ability. These contests reward trainers who develop their Pokémon's presentation and artistic capabilities, creating incentives to nurture aspects beyond battle strength. The contest scene maintains dedicated following separate from battle-focused training culture. Battle facilities offer specialized challenges with unique rule sets, creating environments where unusual strategies become viable. These facilities test specific skills like prediction, adaptation, or resource management, requiring approaches that differ from standard gym battles. Success in facilities often requires dedicated preparation and team optimization for the specific challenge. Underground networks in certain regions contain extensive tunnel systems that trainers explore for items and fossils. These networks hint at massive construction projects whose purposes and builders remain unclear. The tunnels connect disparate surface locations, creating shortcuts that would require extensive engineering to maintain safely. Secret bases allow trainers to customize personal spaces in hidden locations throughout their regions. These bases serve as rest stops and storage locations while providing creative outlets for decoration and design. The locations range from tree hollows to mountain caves, offering diverse environments for personalization. Safari zones create controlled environments where specific Pokémon can be encountered using modified capture methods. The zones maintain ecosystems that support species not found wild elsewhere in regions, sometimes including species from distant areas. The conservation purpose served by maintaining these populations justifies the zone's existence beyond simple trainer entertainment. Battle Frontier facilities push competitive play to extremes, offering challenges that test mastery across diverse battle formats. The Frontier rewards success with unique prizes and recognition, attracting trainers seeking to prove themselves against the most demanding battles available. The facility staffs include some of the strongest trainers globally, individuals who've dedicated themselves to mastering specific battle styles. Ranger organizations work alongside wild Pokémon for conservation and public safety rather than training for battle. Rangers use capture stylers that create temporary partnerships rather than permanent bonds, respecting Pokémon autonomy while still enabling cooperation. The Ranger approach demonstrates alternative relationships between humans and Pokémon beyond the traditional trainer model. Coordinator roles focus on performance and aesthetic development, preparing Pokémon for contests rather than battles. Coordinators study presentation techniques, move combinations that create visual appeal, and Pokémon grooming methods that enhance natural beauty. The coordinator culture maintains distinct traditions and values from battle-focused training communities. Breeder specialization involves deep knowledge of Pokémon genetics, nutrition, and development. Breeders work to produce healthy offspring with desired traits, managing breeding programs that might span generations. The expertise required makes professional breeding a respected specialization, requiring years of study and practice. Researcher careers focus on expanding scientific understanding of Pokémon biology, ecology, evolution, and behavior. Researchers work in laboratories, field stations, or academic institutions, publishing findings that inform training practices and conservation efforts. The research community maintains rigorous standards requiring empirical evidence and peer review. Photography specialization captures Pokémon images in natural settings, documenting behaviors and appearances for scientific or artistic purposes. Photographers develop skills in patience, observation, and timing to capture images of rare or elusive species. The work contributes to conservation by raising awareness while providing visual records of species and behaviors. Cooking with Pokémon involves ingredients derived from or gathered with the help of Pokémon partners. Specialized dishes enhance Pokémon performance or appeal, creating culinary traditions that vary by region. The preparation methods sometimes involve Pokémon abilities, using fire-type partners for cooking or ice types for preservation. Fashion incorporating Pokémon themes creates clothing and accessories inspired by species characteristics or types. The fashion industry collaborates with trainers and Pokémon, sometimes featuring actual Pokémon in shows or advertisements. Regional styles reflect local Pokémon populations, creating distinct aesthetic traditions. Architecture influenced by Pokémon includes structures designed to accommodate specific species or built with Pokémon assistance. Buildings might feature perches for flying types, pools for water types, or reinforced walls for particularly strong species. Construction techniques sometimes rely on Pokémon labor, using their natural abilities to accomplish tasks that human machinery would struggle to complete. Technology development often incorporates insights from Pokémon biology or leverages their abilities. Pokémon power plants employ electric types to generate electricity, while transportation systems might utilize flying or swimming species. The integration of Pokémon into technological systems creates dependencies that make the human-Pokémon relationship economically essential beyond simple companionship. Medicine borrowed from Pokémon abilities or derived from species-produced materials treats conditions in both humans and Pokémon. Certain species produce substances with healing properties, while others possess abilities that accelerate recovery. Medical research studies these capabilities, hoping to develop treatments for diseases affecting both species. Agriculture enhanced by Pokémon labor produces yields that purely mechanical farming cannot match. Grass-type partners encourage plant growth, water types provide irrigation, and ground types prepare soil. The partnership approach creates sustainable farming practices that benefit from Pokémon abilities while avoiding environmental damage that intensive mechanical agriculture causes. Transportation, relying on Pokémon, includes flying services using large flying types, ocean travel with water type assistance, and land routes where ground or rock types clear paths. The Pokémon-based transportation proves more environmentally friendly than mechanical alternatives while providing experiences impossible with conventional vehicles. Energy production from Pokémon abilities offers clean alternatives to fossil fuels, with electric types generating power and fire types providing heat. The ethical implications of using Pokémon as energy sources create ongoing debates about whether such utilization respects Pokémon autonomy or exploits their abilities. Conservation efforts protect habitats essential for wild Pokémon populations, establishing reserves Where species can thrive without human disturbance, the conservation movement recognizes that Pokémon health depends on ecosystem stability, making habitat protection critical for long-term species survival. Environmental restoration uses Pokémon abilities to repair damaged ecosystems, employing grass types to revitalize vegetation, water types to purify contaminated water, and ground types to remediate polluted soil. These restoration efforts demonstrate how human Pokémon cooperation can reverse environmental damage. Climate research studies how Pokémon respond to changing conditions, using species distributions and behaviors as the indicators of environmental shifts. The research reveals that some species adapt while others face population declines, information critical for developing conservation strategies. Ecosystem dynamics involving Pokémon create complex food webs where predator-prey relationships, competition, and cooperation shape community structures. Understanding these dynamics helps predict how changes to one species affect others, informing management decisions. Population studies track species numbers across time and space, identifying trends that indicate conservation success or concern. The studies sometimes reveal unexpected patterns, like populations thriving in areas considered unsuitable or declining despite apparent habitat quality. Migration research follows species movements across regions, mapping routes and identifying critical stopover sites. The research informs conservation by highlighting areas requiring protection to maintain migration corridor integrity. Breeding programs in captivity preserve genetic diversity for rare or endangered species, maintaining populations that might otherwise disappear. The programs balance genetic health with population sustainability, sometimes reintroducing captive-bred individuals into wild habitats. Reintroduction. Efforts relocate Pokémon to regions where their species once lived but disappeared due to human activities or natural events. The reintroductions attempt to restore ecosystem functions that disappeared with the species, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing due to changed conditions. Invasive species management addresses problems created when Pokémon establish in regions outside their native ranges, sometimes outcompeting local species or disrupting established ecosystems. The management strategies range from removal to containment, attempting to protect native biodiversity. Disease patterns in Pokémon populations sometimes mirror human illnesses, while other times presenting unique pathological processes. Certain diseases transfer between species, creating potential for outbreaks that affect multiple populations simultaneously. The emergence of novel diseases raises concerns about whether human activities or environmental changes are creating conditions that favor pathogen development or spread. Parasites affecting Pokémon range from simple organisms that cause mild discomfort to complex species that dramatically alter host behavior. Some parasites manipulate hosts to benefit parasite reproduction, creating zombie-like states where infected Pokémon behave in ways that spread infection. The intricate life cycles of these parasites sometimes involve multiple host species, creating transmission chains that public health efforts struggle to interrupt. Symbiotic relationships between different Pokémon species create partnerships where both participants benefit from cooperation. These relationships might involve cleaning services, where one species removes parasites from another, or protective arrangements where powerful species shield smaller partners from predators in exchange for food location services. The specificity of some symbioses suggests coevolution over extended periods. Competitive interactions between similar species occupying overlapping niches create selection pressures that drive divergence or competitive exclusion. When two species compete for identical resources, often one eventually displaces the other unless they develop specialized adaptations that reduce competition. The observations of these dynamics in action inform understanding of how biodiversity develops and maintains over evolutionary time. Predator-prey cycles demonstrate mathematical relationships where predator populations rise and fall in response to prey abundance. These cycles create oscillations that can span years or decades depending on species lifespans and reproductive rates. The patterns prove remarkably consistent when measured across regions, suggesting that population dynamics follow universal principles despite local environmental variation. Keystone species, whose presence disproportionately affects ecosystem structure, create situations where protecting single species benefits entire communities. The removal of keystone species often triggers cascading effects that degrade ecosystems, while their reintroduction can catalyze recovery. Identifying which species serve keystone roles requires careful ecological study. Trophic cascades occur when changes at one food web level produce effects that ripple through multiple levels. The addition or removal of apex predators, for instance, affects prey populations, which then influences plant communities that support entire ecosystems. Understanding these cascades helps predict how interventions or disturbances will affect ecosystems broadly. Nutrient cycling through Pokémon-mediated processes moves essential elements through ecosystems, with Pokémon serving as vectors that transport nutrients between locations or chemical states. Grass types concentrate nutrients in edible forms. Carnivores concentrate nutrients through consumption, and decomposers return nutrients to soil where plants can access them again. Energy flow through trophic levels demonstrates that only a fraction of energy captured by producers reaches consumers, with most lost as heat through metabolism. This inefficiency limits food chain length and explains why apex predators remain relatively rare compared to species occupying lower trophic positions. Disturbance ecology studies how events like fires, floods, or storms reset ecological succession, creating opportunities for colonization by species adapted to early successional stages. Some ecosystems depend on regular disturbance, deteriorating without periodic resets that some species require for reproduction or survival. Succession processes demonstrate how ecosystems develop over time following disturbance, proceeding through predictable stages from pioneer species through intermediate communities toward climax states. The succession creates changing conditions that favor different species at each stage, producing dynamic communities that shift in composition over decades or centuries. Island biogeography principles explain species richness patterns on isolated habitats, with larger and less isolated locations supporting more species than small remote sites. These principles apply not just to literal islands, but to habitat fragments surrounded by hostile territory, informing conservation strategies for preserving biodiversity in fragmented landscapes. Metapopulation dynamics describe how groups of semi-isolated populations exchange individuals through migration, creating regional networks where local extinctions can be offset by recolonization from nearby populations. This structure provides resilience against disturbances that might eliminate isolated populations, but allows recovery when migrants re-establish extinct local groups. Genetic drift in small populations creates random changes in allele frequencies that can fix disadvantageous traits or eliminate beneficial ones through chance alone. This process makes small populations vulnerable to accumulating harmful mutations while losing genetic diversity that might allow adaptation to changing conditions. Bottleneck events that drastically reduce population sizes create genetic consequences that persist for generations, reducing diversity and potentially fixing harmful alleles at high frequencies. Species that survived bottlenecks often show less genetic variation than relatives that maintained larger populations, making them more vulnerable to environmental changes. Founder effects occur when new populations establish from small numbers of colonizers who don't represent the full genetic diversity of source populations. The limited initial genetic material shapes descendant populations, potentially producing populations genetically distinct from their ancestors, despite no selection pressure favoring the differences. Gene flow between populations through migration maintains genetic similarity that counteracts divergence from drift or local adaptation. The balance between gene flow and local selection determines whether populations diverge into distinct forms or remain genetically similar despite geographic separation. Adaptive radiation describes rapid diversification that occurs when species colonize environments with many empty niches, allowing specialization into diverse forms. The radiation creates sets of related species that differ dramatically in morphology and ecology despite sharing recent common ancestry. Convergent evolution produces similar features in unrelated species facing similar environmental challenges, creating superficial similarities that don't reflect close relationship. The convergence demonstrates that certain solutions prove effective for particular problems regardless of which lineage discovers them. Coevolution between interacting species creates reciprocal evolutionary pressures where changes in one species select for counter-adaptations in partners. These evolutionary arms races can produce elaborate adaptations as each species evolves to stay competitive with the other. Sexual selection operating through mate choice or male-male competition produces traits that enhance reproductive success even when they reduce survival. These traits often appear exaggerated or costly, demonstrating that reproduction success can outweigh survival in evolutionary fitness calculations. Natural selection favoring traits that enhance survival and reproduction creates adaptation to local conditions over generations. The process operates on existing variation, unable to create new features directly, but remarkably effective at shaping populations over time. Mutation provides raw material for evolution, creating novel genetic variants that selection can favor or eliminate. Most mutations prove neutral or harmful, but occasional beneficial mutations allow adaptation to changing conditions or exploitation of new opportunities. Genetic recombination during reproduction shuffles existing variants into novel combinations, creating diversity without new mutations. This shuffling accelerates adaptation by allowing beneficial combinations to assemble faster than if each beneficial mutation had to occur independently. Epigenetics demonstrates that gene expression can change without DNA sequence alterations, creating heritable variation that doesn't involve mutation. These modifications respond to environmental conditions, potentially allowing rapid adaptation that traditional genetics alone couldn't achieve. Developmental plasticity allows individual organisms to develop different phenotypes depending on environmental conditions during growth. This flexibility creates variation within genotypes, potentially allowing populations to persist through environmental changes until genetic adaptation occurs. Behavioral flexibility enables learning and innovation that allow organisms to exploit novel resources or avoid new threats faster than genetic evolution could produce adaptations. The cultural transmission of learned behaviors creates inheritance separate from genetics. Communication systems in Pokémon range from simple alarm calls to complex vocalizations that convey specific information about threats, food sources, or social dynamics. The communication complexity generally correlates with social complexity, with species living in stable groups developing more elaborate signaling systems. Vocal learning ability appears in several Pokémon lineages, allowing individuals to modify their calls through experience rather than relying entirely on innate vocalizations. This learning enables cultural traditions where local populations develop distinct dialects recognizable to members but foreign to outsiders. Chemical communication through pheromones conveys information about reproductive state, territory ownership, or threat warnings. These chemical signals can persist after the signaler departs, creating lasting messages that inform later arrivals about recent events or the signaler's status. Visual displays using coloration, posture, or movement communicate everything from species identity to emotional state. The displays range from subtle signals visible only to conspecifics to dramatic performances obvious to any observer. Tactile communication through physical contact creates bonds between social partners while also conveying information about dominance relationships or emotional states. The gentle touches between bonded pairs differ qualitatively from aggressive physical contact during conflicts. Electric communication in certain species uses discharge patterns to convey information, creating a communication channel unavailable to most species. The electric signals work in dark or murky conditions where visual signals would fail, demonstrating how sensory modality shapes communication possibilities. Magnetic sense abilities allow navigation using Earth's magnetic field, providing directional information that remains constant across locations and conditions. This sense enables remarkable navigation feats, including precise homing to specific locations from vast distances. Electroreception detects electrical fields generated by living organisms or environmental processes, creating awareness of nearby creatures or objects. The sense works in complete darkness and through barriers that block other senses, providing unique perceptual capabilities. Echolocation using reflected sound creates spatial maps of surroundings, allowing navigation and hunting in complete darkness. The precision of echolocation rivals vision in some species, enabling them to distinguish fine details about objects based purely on reflected sound. Infrared detection allows perception of heat signatures, creating awareness of warm-blooded prey or potential threats. This sense provides information unavailable to species limited to visual wavelengths, demonstrating how different sensory systems create unique perceptual worlds. Lateral line systems in aquatic Pokémon detect water movement, creating awareness of nearby swimming organisms or environmental currents. This mechanosensory system provides crucial information for navigation and hunting in aquatic environments. Barometric pressure sensitivity allows weather prediction, with some species reacting to atmospheric pressure changes hours before storms arrive. This sense enables behavioral adjustments that protect from dangerous weather, demonstrating how specialized senses provide survival advantages. Seismic sensitivity detects ground vibrations from approaching organisms or geological events, providing early warning of potential threats. The sense works through substrate rather than air, creating awareness of events beyond visual or auditory range. Lunar cycle sensitivity influences reproductive timing, migration schedules, and other behaviors in species that synchronize activities with moon phases. The sensitivity might involve light detection or other mechanisms that respond to lunar-associated environmental changes. Circadian rhythms regulate daily activity patterns, creating internal clocks that persist even when external time cues are removed. These biological clocks help organisms anticipate regular environmental changes, allowing preparation before conditions actually shift. Seasonal rhythms coordinate annual events like migration, hibernation, or reproduction with appropriate times of year. The rhythms ensure that energy-intensive activities occur when conditions favor success, maximizing offspring survival and adult health. Tidal rhythms in coastal species synchronize activities with ocean tides, ensuring that behaviors like feeding or territory defense occur when tides provide optimal conditions. The rhythms persist in laboratory conditions without tidal cues, demonstrating internal timekeeping. Celestial navigation using sun position allows directional orientation even when landmarks are unavailable. The ability requires compensating for sun movement across the sky, suggesting internal clock mechanisms that track time. Olfactory maps created by remembering scent landmarks allow navigation through areas where visual landmarks prove unreliable. The maps might extend over vast distances, creating spatial awareness based purely on chemical information. Cognitive maps representing spatial relationships allow navigation through complex environments using memory rather than current perception. These mental representations enable route planning and shortcut discovery that simple stimulus response navigation couldn't achieve. Dead reckoning tracks position by integrating movement information, allowing return to starting points even when landmarks or other navigation cues become unavailable. The integration requires keeping running tallies of direction and distance, demanding considerable cognitive resources. Landmark recognition using visual features allows identification of specific locations and orientation relative to known sites. The landmarks might be natural features or human-made structures, with flexible use of whatever provides reliable spatial information. Route following learned through experience allows an efficient travel between frequently visited locations. The routes might take advantage of terrain features or follow paths that minimize an energy expenditure, demonstrating learning and optimization. Exploration strategies balance between exploiting known resources and exploring for potential better opportunities. The balance point varies by resource availability and individual personality, with some individuals consistently exploring more, while others exploit familiar areas. Risk assessment abilities evaluate potential dangers, allowing informed decisions about whether benefits of activities outweigh potential costs. The assessments sometimes prove remarkably sophisticated, accounting for multiple factors, including hunger level, time of day, and predator presence. Numerical abilities in some species allow discrimination between different quantities, enabling comparisons that inform foraging decisions or social assessments. The abilities might extend to simple arithmetic operations in certain highly intelligent species. Causal reasoning, understanding, allows a prediction of event outcomes based on mechanical relationships, enabling tool use and problem solving. The reasoning demonstrates the understanding beyond simple association learning. Theory of mind capabilities, allowing attribution of mental states to others, appear in some highly social species. These abilities enable prediction of others' behaviors based on attributed knowledge or intentions, facilitating both cooperation and deception. Self-awareness indicated by mirror self-recognition or other tests appears in select intelligent species, suggesting consciousness levels that might approach human self-reflection. The awareness raises ethical questions about treatment of beings that might experience existence subjectively. Consciousness questions remain fundamentally difficult to address given the inability to directly access others' subjective experiences. Behavioral evidence suggests varying consciousness levels across species, but definitive determinations remain impossible without access to private mental states. Emotions in Pokémon appear genuine based on behavioral and physiological indicators, with fear, joy, anger, and other states manifesting similarly to human emotions. The question of whether these states feel qualitatively similar to human emotions remains unanswerable, but seems probable given similar neural substrates. Suffering capacity creates ethical obligations regarding Pokémon treatment, with recognition that causing unnecessary pain violates moral principles. The obligations extend beyond direct abuse to include consideration of captive conditions and life quality. Welfare standards for captive Pokémon continue evolving as the understanding of species needs improves. The standards attempt to ensure that captive lives provide satisfaction while allowing for the training and partnership that Pokémon culture centers on. Ethics of training systems question whether Pokémon truly consent to partnership or whether human desires impose on unwilling participants. The question lacks simple answers given apparent enjoyment many Pokémon show in training and battling. Battle ethics address concerns about whether combat for sport constitutes cruelty or whether the structured nature of Pokémon battles makes them acceptable competition. The debates continue with valid points on multiple sides. Capture ethics question the morality of removing Pokémon from wild existence and compelling partnership. The practice remains culturally accepted but faces periodic questioning from activists concerned about Pokémon autonomy. Release considerations address whether releasing unwanted Pokémon into wild populations proves responsible or whether it disrupts ecosystems and abandons partners unable to survive without support. Breeding ethics examine whether deliberate reproduction for human purposes respects Pokémon or exploits their biology for profit or convenience. The intensive breeding operations face particular scrutiny regarding animal welfare. Conservation ethics balance species preservation against the individual Pokémon freedom, creating tensions when protection requires captivity or population management that affects individuals negatively. Human-Pokémon relationships span from simple utility to deep emotional bonds that resemble family relationships. The variety demonstrates that partnerships can take many ethical forms depending on participants' needs and values. Cultural variation in Pokémon treatment creates different norms across regions, with some cultures emphasizing partnership equality while others maintain more utilitarian approaches. The variation reflects broader cultural values beyond Pokémon-specific considerations. Legal frameworks governing Pokémon ownership, training, and battles vary by jurisdiction, creating complex regulatory environments that attempt to balance individual freedom with welfare concerns and public safety. Property status of Pokémon under legal systems creates contradictions where beings with apparent consciousness and emotion are treated as property subject to ownership and trade. The status remains contested with advocates pushing for increased rights recognition. Rights movements advocating for Pokémon legal personhood argue that beings with consciousness deserve legal standing independent of human ownership. The movements have achieved limited success but face resistance from established systems and economic interests. Environmental protection laws sometimes use Pokémon presence as indicators requiring preservation, creating de facto Pokémon protection through habitat conservation. The approach sidesteps direct rights questions while achieving some protection goals. Endangered species protections limit capture and trade of rare Pokémon, creating criminal penalties for violations. The protections prove difficult to enforce given black market demand for rare species. International agreements attempt to coordinate conservation and trade regulation across borders, recognizing that Pokémon and environmental issues transcend political boundaries. The agreements achieve varying success depending on signatory commitment and enforcement capabilities. Black markets and rare Pokémon create illegal trade networks that threaten wild populations, while exploiting legal loopholes and enforcement limitations. The trade proves highly profitable, creating strong incentives that anti-poaching efforts struggle to overcome. Criminal organizations sometimes exploit Pokémon for illegal purposes ranging from smuggling to protection to direct criminal activities. The organization's use of Pokémon complicates law enforcement, given enhanced capabilities that standard human police cannot match. Pokémon abuse as criminal conduct faces prosecution in most jurisdictions, with penalties varying by severity and local legal frameworks. The abuse definitions and enforcement priorities differ regionally, creating inconsistencies in protection. Rehabilitation programs attempt to help abused or neglected Pokémon recover from trauma while finding suitable new placements. The programs face resource limitations, but provide crucial services for Pokémon rescued from bad situations. Historical human-Pokémon relationships show that partnership extends back thousands of years, with archaeological evidence demonstrating ancient cooperation in hunting, agriculture, and warfare. The long history suggests that human civilization developed alongside Pokémon rather than independently. Archaeological sites containing Pokémon remains provide insights into species distributions and human-Pokémon relationships during various historical periods. The sites sometimes reveal unexpected species presences or uses that modern culture has forgotten. Artistic depictions in ancient artifacts demonstrate how historical cultures perceived and valued Pokémon, with recurring motifs suggesting consistent recognition of certain species' importance or symbolic meanings across cultures. Written records from early civilizations document Pokémon encounters and relationships, providing textual evidence that supplements archaeological materials. The records sometimes describe species or behaviors that don't match contemporary knowledge, creating mysteries about whether species changed or records contain inaccuracies. Mythological traditions incorporate Pokémon as characters in creation story, moral tales, and explanatory narratives that helped pre-scientific cultures understand natural phenomena. These mythologies preserve cultural wisdom while demonstrating deep historical engagement with Pokémon. Religious significance of certain Pokémon in various traditions creates sacred status that influences how adherents interact with these species. The religious connections sometimes provide protection for rare species through taboos against capture or harm. Economic importance throughout history shows Pokémon contributing to human prosperity through labor, companionship, protection, and materials. The economic value created incentives for domestication and partnership that shaped both species' development. Warfare applications of Pokémon in historical conflicts demonstrate how military advantages drove certain partnership developments. The strategic value of powerful Pokémon influenced regional power dynamics and historical outcomes. Agricultural revolutions enabled by Pokémon assistance allowed food production increases that supported population growth and civilization development. The agricultural partnerships continue providing substantial economic benefits. Transportation innovations using Pokémon created trade networks and cultural exchanges that would have been impossible with human-only travel capabilities. The transportation advantages accelerated historical development by facilitating communication and resource distribution. Industrial applications of Pokémon abilities during early industrialization provided power sources and manufacturing capabilities before mechanical alternatives developed. Some traditional Pokémon-based industries persist despite mechanical competition. Modern technology integration shows Pokémon abilities complementing rather than being replaced by machines, creating hybrid systems that optimize both biological and mechanical capabilities. The integration demonstrates how traditional partnerships evolve while remaining relevant. Future trajectories remain uncertain as technological advancement, environmental change, and evolving cultural values reshape human Pokémon relationships. The future might bring closer integration, regulatory separation, or outcomes currently unforeseen. Climate change impacts on Pokémon distributions become increasingly apparent as temperature shifts and precipitation pattern changes force species migrations towards suitable conditions. Some species adapt to changing environments through behavioral modifications or rapid evolution, while others face population declines as habitats become unsuitable. The range Schiffinkes create novel species assemblages as Pokémon from previously separated regions encounter each other in newly suitable areas. Habitat loss through urbanization and agricultural expansion eliminates ecosystems faster than conservation efforts can protect them, creating fragmented landscapes where isolated populations struggle to maintain viability. The fragmentation prevents migration that would allow climate adaptation, trapping species in deteriorating conditions without escape routes. Pollution effects on Pokémon health manifest through direct toxicity, bioaccumulation of contaminants, and disruption of reproductive processes. Aquatic species prove particularly vulnerable to water pollution, while aerial species face challenges from air quality degradation. The contamination sometimes produces sublethal effects that reduce fitness without killing individuals directly, creating population declines that occur gradually. Ocean acidification caused by atmospheric carbon absorption threatens marine Pokémon, particularly species with calcium-based shells or skeletons. The changing ocean chemistry makes shell formation more energetically expensive, potentially affecting growth and survival rates for vulnerable species. Deforestation removes forest habitat that numerous species depend on, creating losses that extend beyond immediate cleared areas as edge effects and fragmentation compromise remaining forest quality. The forest loss particularly impacts species requiring old growth conditions that take centuries to develop. Overfishing removes prey species that marine Pokémon depend on, creating food scarcity that ripples through ocean ecosystems. The fishing pressure sometimes directly captures Pokémon as bycatch, adding population stress beyond indirect food web effects. Light pollution disrupts nocturnal behaviors in species that rely on darkness for hunting, navigation, or reproduction. The artificial illumination creates ecological traps where species make maladaptive decisions based on misleading environmental cues. Noise pollution from human activities interferes with acoustic communication in species that rely on sound for social coordination or predator detection. The anthropogenic noise creates masking effects that reduce communication distances, potentially disrupting behaviors essential for survival and reproduction. Pesticide exposure harms Pokémon through direct toxicity or by eliminating insect prey that many species depend on. The chemicals accumulate in food webs, creating highest concentrations in predators at food chain tops, where even small environmental contamination produces dangerous exposure levels. Invasive species introduced to new regions through human activities compete with native Pokémon, sometimes outcompeting locals through traits that evolved in different competitive environments. The invasions restructure ecosystems in ways that favor adaptable generalists while harming specialized native species. Disease transmission, accelerated by human movement and environmental stress, creates outbreak conditions that threaten vulnerable populations. The diseases sometimes jump between previously isolated populations when human activities create connections that natural barriers would prevent. Genetic pollution through escaped domestic Pokémon breeding with wild populations introduces captive selected traits into wild gene pools, potentially reducing fitness in natural environments. The introgression sometimes proves irreversible once hybridization begins. Resource exploitation depletes food sources that Pokémon depend on, creating scarcity that affects population sizes and health. The depletion occurs through both direct harvest and habitat modification that reduces resource production. Urban adaptation by certain species demonstrates remarkable flexibility, with some Pokémon thriving in cities by exploiting human-provided resources and modified habitats. The urban adapters often show behavioral innovations that allow them to navigate human-dominated landscapes successfully. Synanthropic species that benefit from human presence by exploiting our waste, structures, or resource concentration become more common as human footprint expands. These species sometimes reach pest status when populations grow beyond levels that humans tolerate. Extinction risks for rare species increase as combined stressors from climate change, habitat loss, and other factors push vulnerable populations toward tipping points where recovery becomes impossible without intervention. The extinction represents permanent loss of unique evolutionary lineages that took millions of years to develop. De-extinction possibilities using genetic technology might allow revival of extinct species from preserved genetic material, though technical challenges and ethical concerns complicate implementation. The revived species would enter changed worlds that might not support them as original habitats did. Assisted migration programs deliberately relocate species to areas beyond current ranges where climate projections suggest future suitable conditions. The controversial strategy attempts to prevent extinction by moving species ahead of climate change rather than waiting for natural range shifts. Captive breeding maintains genetic reservoirs for critically endangered species, preserving evolutionary potential even when wild populations collapse. The programs hope to eventually reintroduce captive populations if threats can be reduced enough to allow wild survival. Habitat restoration reconstructs degraded ecosystems, attempting to recreate conditions that support native species assemblages. The restoration ranges from passive recovery after threat removal to active intervention, planting native vegetation and managing invasive species. Corridor creation connects fragmented habitats, allowing movement between patches that maintains genetic connectivity and enables range shifts responding to climate change. The corridors work best when integrated into landscape planning rather than added as afterthoughts. Protected area expansion increases land and water dedicated to conservation, creating refugia where species can persist despite pressures in surrounding areas. The expansion requires balancing conservation goals with human needs for resources and development. Sustainable practices in agriculture, forestry, and fishing attempt to meet human needs while minimizing impacts on Pokémon populations and habitats. The practices recognize that long-term productivity depends on maintaining ecosystem health. Green infrastructure in urban settings creates habitat patches within cities, supporting Pokémon populations while providing ecosystem services like stormwater management and heat island reduction. The infrastructure demonstrates how human development can incorporate rather than eliminate natural elements. Ecosystem services provided by Pokémon and their habitats include pollination, seed dispersal, pest control, and nutrient cycling that benefit human welfare. Recognizing these services creates economic arguments for conservation beyond purely ecological or ethical motivations. Carbon sequestration by healthy ecosystems helps mitigate climate change, creating climate benefits that extend beyond biodiversity conservation. The ecosystems that support Pokémon also contribute to global climate stability. Water purification by natural wetlands and forests reduces treatment costs while improving water quality. The Pokémon-inhabited ecosystems provide filtration and processing that technological alternatives cannot economically match. Flood control through intact floodplains and coastal wetlands reduces damage from extreme weather events, demonstrating how natural systems provide protection that built infrastructure alone cannot achieve. The protection benefits increase as climate change intensifies storm severity. Soil formation and maintenance by ecosystem processes creates agricultural potential that soil degradation can destroy faster than natural processes rebuild. The Pokémon contributing to these processes provide invisible but essential services. Cultural values of natural environments and their Pokémon inhabitants enrich human experience through recreation, inspiration, and connection to natural world. These intangible benefits prove difficult to quantify, but remain important to quality of life. Economic value generated by Pokémon-based tourism creates incentives for conservation when local communities benefit from protecting rather than exploiting resources. The sustainable income can outweigh extractive alternatives while preserving resources for future benefit. Scientific knowledge gained from Pokémon research advances understanding of biology, evolution, behavior, and ecology, with applications extending beyond Pokémon to biology generally. The research depends on maintaining populations that can be studied. Medical discoveries from Pokémon-derived compounds or inspired by Pokémon biology provide treatments impossible to develop without these biological inspirations. The potential for future discoveries depends on preventing extinctions that would eliminate unstudied species. Biomimicry applications. Copying Pokémon adaptations into human technology demonstrate how biological solutions inspire engineering innovations. The inspiration requires living examples that detailed study can analyze. Educational opportunities provided by interacting with Pokémon create learning experiences that books and screens cannot replicate, fostering understanding and appreciation of natural world that supports conservation attitudes, spiritual connections that many people feel toward Pokémon, and natural environments fulfill needs that modern society often neglects, providing grounding and perspective that benefit mental health and well-being. Aesthetic appreciation of Pokémon beauty and natural world artistry enriches human experience in ways that contribute to cultural development and individual satisfaction beyond material concerns. Partnership diversity ranging from working relationships to deep bonds demonstrates that human Pokémon connections can take forms matching participant needs and values rather than following a single model. Mutual benefits, when relationships prove positive for both humans and Pokémon, create win-win outcomes that justify and sustain partnerships across generations. The benefits include companionship, security, purpose, and shared achievement. Individual variation in both humans and Pokémon ensures that ideal partnership structures differ between specific pairs, requiring flexibility in cultural expectations to accommodate diverse relationship needs. Communication development between partners through experience and attention allows coordination that transcends simple command obedience to achieve cooperative problem-solving and shared decision-making. Trust building over time through consistent positive interactions creates bonds that allow partners to function as cohesive units facing challenges cooperatively rather than as master directing servant. Mutual respect. Acknowledging partner autonomy and worth creates healthy relationships where both participants' needs receive consideration rather than one side's interests dominating. Ethical partnerships recognize power imbalances inherent in human Pokémon relationships while striving to minimize exploitation through attention to Pokémon welfare and preference. Quality of life considerations for both partners ensure that relationships enhance rather than diminish well-being, with attention to physical health, emotional satisfaction, and behavioral opportunity. Retirement planning for older Pokémon addresses how partnerships should evolve as Pokémon age beyond active training or working years, ensuring that long-term partners receive appropriate care through declining years. End-of-life care for dying. Pokémon represents final obligation that committed partnerships entail, providing comfort and dignity rather than abandonment when Pokémon can no longer reciprocate actively. Grief processes following Pokémon death affect trainers deeply when bonds were strong, creating mourning that others sometimes struggle to understand if they haven't experienced similar partnerships. Memorial practices honoring deceased partners help trainers process loss while celebrating relationships that enriched their lives, creating ritual closure that supports healthy grieving. Legacy considerations. Recognizing how partnerships shape individual development demonstrate that Pokémon influence extends beyond active relationships into lasting impacts on who partners become. Cross-generational transfer of partnership knowledge from experienced trainers to beginners preserves wisdom that casual instruction cannot convey, maintaining relationship quality across time. Cultural traditions surrounding Pokémon partnerships create shared practices that connect individuals to broader communities while providing structure for relationship development. Innovation in partnership approaches allows relationship evolution as understanding improves and cultural values shift, preventing stagnation that would make partnerships less relevant to contemporary needs. Research advancement continues expanding knowledge about Pokémon biology, behavior, and ecology through studies that combine field observation with laboratory analysis, creating comprehensive understanding that informs both science and practical partnership. Technology development creates tools that enhance research capabilities while also improving partnership quality through better healthcare, training methods, and welfare monitoring. Collaboration between researchers, trainers, conservationists, and policymakers produces integrated approaches to Pokémon management that no single group could achieve independently. Public engagement through education and outreach creates support for research, conservation, and ethical treatment by fostering appreciation for Pokémon and understanding of challenges they face. Global coordination addresses challenges that transcend regional boundaries, recognizing that Pokémon populations and environmental threats require international cooperation to manage effectively. Adaptive management acknowledges uncertainty in complex systems, using monitoring and adjustment cycles that respond to observed outcomes rather than assuming initial plans remain optimal as conditions change. Long-term commitment required for meaningful progress in research, conservation, and partnership quality improvement demands sustained effort across years or decades rather than short-term initiatives. Interdisciplinary approaches combining biology, psychology, sociology, economics, and other fields provide comprehensive perspectives that discipline-specific work cannot achieve. Stakeholder inclusion in decision processes ensures that affected parties' perspectives receive consideration, creating policies with broader support and better addressing diverse needs. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.